Gates flagged, making his side the winner of the training. And with that, the first
person who said he would use magic. He struck again and sent a wave of fire into the swarm, while she pointed out that he was really just punching everything. The old Taoist slowed down, lightning wrapped around his fist, and asked what she meant. This was obviously magic. The yellow-eyed girl answered with doubtful sarcasm that sure, it was, but something terrifying appeared above her. A giant claw pushed out of a green portal. The girl saw two massive monsters and tried to make sense of it, warning her partner to be careful. She leaped across the rocks at top speed, thinking the monsters had come through that portal, and that should have been impossible. Dropping in from above, the deputy panicked.
can't fall.
panicked and yelled for him to run. She fired off 2 aura blasts and shouted for him to get out. She'd open a path so they could escape together. He just had to hurry. But one of the lizards suddenly fixed her with a deadly glare. Then several smaller ones swarmed in front of it. As bodies dropped, Ji-hai wondered if the boss even cared that the smaller monsters were dying. A sudden wave of dread hit her, and she called out loudly to her companion. He was standing right in front of a huge storm of monsters. Watching it, the yellow-eyed girl realized the smaller monsters were definitely not moving on their own. She understood the giant ones were controlling them. Thinking back on what happened, the pink-haired girl realized the small monsters had been throwing themselves in front of attacks meant for the bosses. She raised her dagger and knew the fight wouldn't end until the big monsters went down. She just had to figure out how to reach them. She hesitated as she watched the giant swarm and wondered if the hero was holding up. He stood in the middle of the circle, and their eyes met. The way he looked at her made it clear he was doing it on purpose. The killer let out a breath, unable to tell what he was thinking, and wondered if answering through voice communication was really that hard. She opened her eyes and anxiously said this kind of anomaly had never appeared before. No matter how strong he was, it was still dangerous. She had to help him, but she couldn't reach him while he was up in the air. Then she spotted a cub. She jumped onto its back and flew up, thinking the monster cluster around the protagonist wouldn't notice her there. If so, reaching him would be easy. The deputy stayed tense and serious, thinking he just had to hang on a little longer. If she took down the mutated monster giving off that strange aura, another winged creature slammed into her and knocked her down. Ji-hai started falling and cursed. Barely managing to save herself, she stabbed the nearest target and held on. When she turned, a huge dragon was roaring right at her, and the deputy smiled, asking if it had finally noticed her. She leaped straight at it and thought it was too late now. This was one-on-one. Raising both daggers, she glared at it and thought no monster in her game could stop her. Then she used Shadow Dance and ordered it to open up, but a bunch of smaller monsters burst out from under its wing. The beauty fell back and, with a hopeless smile, wondered how fast she could clear all this. Then a shot tore past her. It was energy from the hero, slicing apart every living thing around him. The pink-haired girl was stunned. He was using a power blade without resources, and controlling several blades at once through the sword of exploding air. Seeing the fan of swords around the protagonist, she finally understood what an astral body was. He said this was just a hunter role-playing game. He held out his hand and said firmly that it ended here. A non-stop storm of lightning-fast swords poured down, skewering small lizards one after another. Then the barrage grew even stronger, enough to block out the sunlight, and the attacks kept getting heavier. The sight was stunning, like a comet crashing down. From the cliff, the deputy watched it all and saw rocks raining down too. Remembering the rift, she thought the protagonist had saved them this time, but a bigger problem remained. What if this started happening in other dungeons? She grew tense and touched her chin, thinking about how the system judged dungeon danger, and what level of hunter should clear it. Would that still matter against mutated monsters in a portal like this? A little despair crossed the yellow-eyed girl's face, and she thought it would all be destroyed. The hero picked up the blue crystal, while she kept thinking that the festival didn't matter right now. They needed a full investigation. Ji-hai immediately imagined him reaching for her, and thought he would never miss a chance if she let her guard down. If she split her focus, his guild could destroy them in an instant. She looked down sadly, wondering what she should do, but a stone suddenly waved in front of her face, and she asked what it was. The protagonist was standing close by. He asked why she was spacing out, then pointed out he had asked how this stone was different from the others. Looking at it, the beauty explained that it was a monster skill stone. Since he killed a large specimen, he got a rare skill stone as the owner. The hero crushed it right away and stayed silent, while she kept thinking about the boss. Then Ji-hai suddenly surprised him by turning sharply. The yellow-eyed girl looked at him seriously, and said she had something important to tell him. A month later, on a sunny day, some young men talked about the Sun Festival schedule, and looked forward to it. They walked past Cholo, who sat with his head down while listening to talk about the now famous protagonist. He lifted his head anxiously as rumors spread that Shen Yong was the Dawn Guild's secret weapon. He looked up at the skyscraper and thought he was done for. At the same time, a glass smashed over a bespectacled man's head, as someone demanded to know if he was joking. At an emergency meeting of the Twilight Guild's top brass, a short-haired man pointed at him and said Dawn had chosen this guy as its savior, yet they still couldn't learn where he'd been for the last 14 years, let alone his level or class. The employee could only apologize. But the shouting man suddenly went quiet when the leader spoke. He calmly sipped whiskey on the rocks, legs crossed, smiling. The green-eyed man narrowed his eyes and told him to sit down. Park obeyed at once, and the guildmaster said Dawn seemed to be worried about something. Rising from his seat, he said they had picked their trump card too fast. Whether it was a bluff or a jackpot would only be clear once every card was on the table. On the screen in front of them was the face Ti-hun lowered his head with a dangerous smile, and said they had to destroy the seed of discord. The bespectacled man sat in the middle of a coffee shop. He nervously checked his watch and tapped his foot. Looking at the time again, he said the other person should be here any second. Then the protagonist showed up, and he hurried to greet him. Cha Shin-hyun stood with his head slightly lowered, while the employee thanked him for accepting such a sudden invitation. The old Taoist, dressed like an office worker, started to raise his head when suddenly something caught his eye. He noticed a man behind him working on a laptop, even as someone held out a hand to greet him. The secretary pulled his hand back and turned toward the guests. At last, they shook hands. The hero first planned to keep it simple, but then he remembered his sister telling him to watch how he spoke, so he greeted him formally instead. Cholo looked at him nervously and said it was a great honor to meet him, while inwardly wondering what kind of rude jerk he'd been. But on the other hand, Yu Tien, the bespectacled man, got even more nervous, thinking about his job today, learn everything he could about this guy. Then he finally explained why he had asked Cha Shin-hyun to meet. He dug through his bag in a panic, searching his briefcase. Watching him, the protagonist wondered if this team really needed watching, if this was the level of people they had. He set a device on the table. He asked what it was, and the man said it was the button. A curtain-like barrier spread around them. He explained that it blocked outside noise and kept their voices from leaking, making it perfect for a private talk. The reincarnated man gave him a smug look and asked if this was really what they had prepared for his visit. Growing serious, the bespectacled man got to the point. The Twilight Guild wanted to partner with his Unlimited Guild. Leaning back with an annoyed look, the hero thought he had expected this. He asked if they had seen his showing at the Sun Festival, and reminded him that he was working with the Dawn Guild. The employee quickly lowered his hand and said they knew that, and they were fully aware Dawn was backing him. Then he added that they also knew about the hidden issues between him and the team, while also seeing how well his dungeon raids with the guild leader had gone. The hero listened calmly as the man continued. He pointed out that Cha Shin-hyun still had not joined Dawn, and instead had made a one-man guild while only cooperating with them. Without meeting his eyes, the young man said that based on all that, they believed there was some distance between him and Dawn. The protagonist smiled to himself. This man was sharper than he first thought, and he took back his earlier judgment. The offer was tempting too. They claimed they could give him something his current guild never could. Their information was hard to dismiss. The bespectacled man flipped through his papers and asked to explain the final contract terms, but the protagonist cut him off with a slap on the table, saying he did not need to hear them. As he got up to leave, he waved a hand and said he had come out of curiosity, but this had only wasted his time. He would reject any offer they made. Cholo stared in disbelief and asked if he was really refusing before even hearing the full deal. Watching him go, Cholo nervously called out that if he dropped the solar ritual, they would grant whatever he wanted. But the protagonist answered without hesitation that he owed Jaehi. The old Taoist turned back with a smile and said he hated losing. The employee tried once more to stop him, asking him to wait because if he left like this, then the kid called after him with tears in his eyes, thinking the man was a real scoundrel since he still had so much left to say. Then the guild leader removed his mask and asked how long he planned to stand there staring off into the distance. He rose from his seat and walked over. The green-eyed man placed a hand on him and chilled him by saying he already knew what had been said. With an earphone in, he added that they had only been trying to stretch the conversation as long as possible. The guildmaster grabbed his tie, frightening him even more, and said all that eavesdropping had been useless. Then Ti-hun started walking off with his arms spread. When the man apologized for being rude to him, Ti-hun brushed it aside. He had more important things to worry about. The head of Twilight stared ahead and said it was strange. Narrowing his eyes, he wondered who that man really was. Ji-hae listened on the phone with a smile, amused by what had happened. She said the enemy must be furious right now. Walking down the street, the hero smiled and said they probably guessed he was from Murim, but the name of the Supreme Emperor of the Sword had not spread that far. Then he remembered the guy behind the counter and said that the moment he entered the cafe, he felt him open his outer kai, which proved his guess. The pink-haired girl said that kind of person was cautious and got jumpy whenever things stopped going their way. The yellow-eyed girl leaned on the wall with a smile when he said that man would not bother her for a while. Then he asked how the dungeon investigation was going, and she said that thanks to him, there had been no new complaints since that dungeon. Looking at the screen, she added with a faint smile that at least for now, that was still true. Thinking back to their raid, she admitted she would have worked herself to death if he had not handled the investigation in the dungeon of ominous birds, and she thanked him. He asked what else needed to be done, and whether there was anything specific. She looked at the phone in surprise, and asked him to repeat that. The hero grew tense. She asked why he seemed so down, and what was wrong, but he only answered with silence. Then his sister walked up and asked if he had finished talking. With a sad look, she clasped her hands and told him it was time to go. The black-haired man put away his phone at once, agreed, and thought there was nothing else to do. Together, they went to the cemetery. Yoon-seol touched the glass and faced her parents. Through tears, she told them her brother had come back. The old Taoist stood behind her, worn out and silent. Thinking he already knew that, he turned his head away, closed his eyes, and thought coming here had been a mistake. Looking at the portrait, he realized how different he was now. Even standing before his parents' remains, he could not shed a single tear. He turned and started to walk off, thinking that even if he showed her this inhuman side of himself, his sister would only cry in silence, and it would not help her at all. She turned from him and asked if he truly felt nothing. Her words hit hard. She said he did not look sad or even hurt, and the hero only fell into a dark silence as she faced him. Following him anxiously, she forced a smile and asked why he would not say anything. Uneasy, the long-haired girl tried to joke that what she said was true, but he cut in and simply apologized. He started to leave, thinking he could not hide it forever. He admitted he had become someone who could not show her what she wanted to see. Yoon-seol clenched her teeth in resentment. She kicked the ground and shouted, asking if he even knew how strange he was. Why was he apologizing? What did he think she wanted to see? The black-haired girl stood there with a fierce look, trying to figure out what she really wanted. At once, she remembered riding on his back when they were kids. Covering her face with one hand, the archer asked why he had changed so much, and why he was still acting so cold. The hero only looked at her without showing his eyes. She confessed she was not even sure he was still her brother, and he answered that too much time had passed for either of them to stay the same. But his sister turned away with a hard look and said it did not matter. She had lived fine on her own until today. He silently watched her leave. Sadness flickered in his eyes, and he thought again that he never should have come. He remembered countless deaths. Her question, why had he changed so much, and did she really want the answer, stayed in his mind. Then he realized he wanted that answer too, and wondered what had happened to him. Suddenly, a glitching notification appeared behind him. It asked, why? And he wondered where this Murim-style dialogue box had come from. Among chains, the god of war smiled, and asked why he still wore the shape of a human. Hearing his name, the hero was badly shaken. He stared at the message in front of him, wondering why it was talking about humanity, and what kind of nonsense this was. His hands started shaking. More notifications appeared, telling him to stop resisting for no reason, and saying they could even help his motivation. The black-haired man answered coldly, that this being was still acting on its own, as always. Then he demanded to know who it even was. Shin-hyun gave a playful reply, and asked if he did not know the heavenly god of war. The protagonist hugged at his tie with a smile, as the being kept promising to take everything from him, and told him to wait. He called it madness. Under the bright sun, the hero smiled and said he did not know who it was or why it was doing this to him. When the reincarnated man spoke of a ban, everything around him began to shake. Lowering his head with a smile, he said he would find that thing and tear it apart, but not a notification popped up, telling him to just wait. Then, the last traces of light faded like they had never been there. The black-haired man stared ahead, dead serious. He frowned and said that all he foe, Yoon-soo suddenly stopped. She turned around with tears in her eyes, not seeing anyone behind her. The girl looked forward again. Tears ran down her face as she muttered that he had not even followed her, and called him a vile scoundrel. Several days later, the announcer at the festival jumped up from her seat and loudly greeted everyone. Shaking her head, she nearly startled her co-host, and said this festival was made for the heroes who clear dungeons and hunt monsters. People had been waiting for it with huge excitement, and her partner quietly thought he picked the wrong person to work with. She slapped both hands on the table, and announced that they were starting right away. The brown-eyed girl shot up from her seat, full of energy, and called it the biggest event in Korea. As confetti filled the arena, she shouted that the festival had officially begun. The crowd roared while she explained that the festival brings the hunter world together, and creates a short truce. A little girl walked hand in hand with her mother, as the announcer said this was part of the solar festival, where people could watch hunters fight up close. Che listened, and said it felt a lot like the Olympics, or the World Cup. The deputy smiled, agreeing that it was pretty much the same, at least to the public. Hunters were the biggest stars. Holding her mug, the girl said hunters were basically like movie superheroes, with real powers, though a lot of information about them was tightly controlled worldwide. Then, she added that the festival also helps make hunters seem more friendly to the public. Che stayed serious and said nothing, so she called out to him. She admitted the whole thing felt a little weird. Setting her cup down, she asked if he had fought with Yoon-seol, and Shin-hyun looked even more uneasy. She remembered they had arrived separately, and said it made sense. They already looked tense back then. The pink-haired girl pressed him for answers, sure he had messed up again. In his head, he admitted she was right. The yellow-eyed girl was shocked when he asked her to find him a quiet, hidden place to stay. She got even more alarmed after he said the Murim status window had sent him a message. With chains and strange notifications still in his mind, he admitted he did not know who his enemy really was, but he believed the heavenly god of war was coming after him. As his sister reached for the bow, he said he did not know how long he could hold out. The black-haired girl picked up the bow sadly, and her brother warned that staying near him would put her in danger. The deputy quickly sat up and told him to wait. This was too much to process at once. She tried to calm things down, saying that even if everything he said was true, living apart for Yoon-seol's safety still felt strange. But then he turned his head. Watching a family on TV, Shin-hyun said Yoon-seol did not need an older brother like him. Still staring at the happy child, he went on and said the brother she remembered and hoped to see again was already gone. And while he said it would be better if things went back to how they were before, a punch suddenly flew at him. The killer's fist stopped against his chest. She lowered her head and said she hated getting involved in family problems, but if her own brother said something like that, she would have punched him for real. And the old Taoist was stunned when she said she seemed to know more about his sister than he did. Just then, an employee came in and asked if the vice leader was there. He stopped at the strange scene in front of him, then nervously said the event was about to start. The pink-haired girl turned red, scolded him for not knocking, then told Chai they would finish this later, and that he was not allowed to go anywhere until she came back. The black-haired man quietly watched her leave without a word. He scratched his cheek and thought this was his punishment. In the arena, the announcer told everyone to watch the opening ceremony before the festival began. The leaders of Dawn, who organized the solar festival, were coming out to greet their rivals. The leader of Dawn stepped out from one side, and the vice leader of Twilight came from the other. The excited host told her co-host that some viewers might not know Jae-hee and Tae-hun used to be in the same guild, and he awkwardly confirmed it. As the bastard reached toward the yellow-eyed girl, they explained that the two had started as ordinary hunters together, but now stood on opposite sides at the top. He added with a sly smile that a lot had changed since then. A fake smile sat on his face, but the pink-haired girl was grinding her teeth in anger. Even so, she forced a smile, tilted her head, and asked if he had been doing well. Then she glanced at his deputy and remarked that the assassin boy filling her old spot had grown up nicely. At the mention of him, he reached for his weapon, but someone stopped him. Tae-hun smirked and said he had heard they were very busy taking care of new recruits. Raising a hand, he added that they had always looked after the weak, with the bodies of her dead comrades filling his thoughts. He told her that this time he would personally remove everything blocking her path. She turned her head aside and let out a breath. Anger flashed across her face as she threw the words back at him and told him to go ahead and try. The green-eyed man clearly enjoyed hearing that, and at that same moment, the solar festival began. Their handshake crashed together with a burst of aura. One hunter frowned and shouted. He drove his spear into the girl's shield again and again. She gritted her teeth, tried to hold the defense, and cursed. But then her opponent lifted his weapon and brought it down hard, splitting the shield and injuring her. Blood burst from the blonde's mouth, and she started coughing. From above, the announcer declared that Sanmo of Twilight had won Warrior Tournament Match 5. She called it incredible power, even with a blunted weapon made for the contest. He had badly hurt his opponent. Still sipping coffee cognac. T-Hun smiled and said that was only expected from Dawn. It had been a long time since their fighter had needed that much time to beat someone, and either way, the girl had never been a real threat. The pink-haired girl glared at him, thinking how arrogant he was. Then, the green-eyed man rose and said he would step out for a bit. On his way out, he said he hoped the next match would be at least a little more entertaining. The deputy silently watched his back as he left. The guildmaster came through the archway, and an assassin behind him spoke up. Pulling out a dagger, he asked when he could act. The man flashed the blade and asked when Jihai would be killed, and a finger suddenly clamped over the weapon. The man in the green vest told him to relax. It would happen soon. Looking away with a smile, he said everything comes in its time, then asked for the name of the hero's sister. He said he wanted to greet her personally. The scene shifted to an abandoned city as the host greeted the audience and announced the Archer Survival Arena. She said this event would let everyone watch the best archers from each guild. Beaming with excitement, she added that the qualifiers were about to begin and asked her co-host who he was cheering for. He stroked his chin and said there were many strong contestants, but he personally supported Yun Xiao because she was young, talented, and already showing great results. As Cha's sister got ready to head out, the commentary brought up the recent Red Wolf dungeon incident. With the girl standing turned away, two people behind her wondered if she was really competing, why she had even been allowed in, and what would happen if she did the same thing again after killing her subordinate. But the black-haired girl suddenly turned and loudly asked why they would not say it to her face if they were already talking. The two instantly covered their mouths, scared. She stared them down with folded arms and said nothing. They quickly backed away, and the beauty leaned against the wall with a long breath. Her mind went back to the day at the cemetery, and she thought about what she had not said. She was angry again, but also hurt. Why was he avoiding her? Then someone called for her. A short-haired girl nervously asked her to come to the waiting room because someone was there to see her. She was surprised and stayed quiet. A spark lit in her eyes as she guessed who it might be, but she was completely wrong. Waiting there was the deputy, who asked how she was feeling, and the huntress answered coldly. She asked why Jae had come before the match, and Jae said she was only there to support one of the guild's promising hunters. Yoon Sol got annoyed and said she had planned to come in with her brother, but he had disappeared somewhere. The yellow-eyed girl noticed her mood and grew worried, though she kept it to herself. The archer froze when she was told they should clear up the misunderstanding between them. She frowned at once, and when the girl kept coming closer, she raised her hands and asked since when Jae had started meddling in other people's business. Jae replied that she was only worried, as both a sponsor and her boss, but the black-haired girl only laughed at that. Hands on her hips, she admitted she never liked her. To Yoon Sol, it felt like they kept her brother close and used him however they wanted. Was she wrong? Thinking of her brother's eyes, Yoon Sol said he chose to become a hunter after meeting her, even though he had only just started acting like himself again. Fighting back her anger, she said Cha never should have become a hunter. Her voice shook as she asked what he was even trying to do by getting stronger. He was chasing something, and he never told her what. That made the pink-haired girl tense up, while Yoon Sol went on, saying she had a bad feeling. Then Yoon Sol broke down. Through tears, she said he wasn't the brother she knew anymore. He'd changed and grown distant. A voice over the speakers announced the archery match would start in 1 minute, and called all participants to the arena. She quickly wiped her face and apologized, saying she hadn't meant to show that side of herself. As she turned to leave, she was stopped with one last thought. Maybe he never wanted to change. Yehi, looking down, said she understood. She'd gone through something like that herself. Her thoughts drifted back to when she was a killer. In that memory, she stood over a body at night and thought about Cha going into hell, where he could die any second. He spent so long there alone that staying normal was impossible. Back then, the yellow-eyed girl showed no emotion as she said he probably didn't want his sister to see that side of him. Still walking away, the archer said it was weird that she had to hear about her own brother from her. With a faint smile, Yoon Xiao added that he probably saw her as someone he couldn't rely on. Then she took it a step further, saying that wasn't the case with the one he felt close to. The killer stared at her back and said nothing. But a second later, Yoon Xiao suddenly looked back in a pointed silence, spotting part of someone's back behind the wall. She said she'd been wondering where he went, but he'd been here the whole time. Cha was standing behind the wall. She called him out, saying he promised to leave her alone, yet he was still worrying about her. He brushed it off, claiming he was just passing by. The pink-haired girl almost stepped in, but then she paused, collected herself, and shocked him by saying he was the same. Shae grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall, demanding to know why he couldn't just tell the truth, and why he still acted like his sister was the little kid he remembered. Shae slowly understood what she meant as she pressed harder, asking if he really thought hiding his real feelings from his sister was helping. Her voice turned sharp. If he had something to say, he needed to say it plainly. Then she let out a breath, stepped back, and told him to follow her. A flare gun fired as she said she'd show him a side of his little sister he didn't know. The flare shot high overhead, lighting up the area. At once, something tore across the ground at high speed. The Dawn members rushed into motion, and the announcer began explaining the qualifying round. In this archer survival match, 6 teams from Dusk and Dawn would face off. At the booth, Taehyun watched and wondered how it would turn out. Smiling, he said he hoped Jihai would enjoy what he prepared. Looking at the upset archer, he added that this was only the start. Right then, her earpiece crackled with Code C, enemy contact, while another team called for help under Code E. Once she reached the roof, another call came in. Code B, enemy spotted 200 meters away. She remembered the pink-haired girl saying he didn't want his sister to see his weak side. Then she pictured her brother standing with his back to her. Furious, she punched the wall hard enough to crack it and cursed. Grinding her teeth, she wondered if he really thought silence would keep her from understanding. Why couldn't he just tell her what was going on? Instead, he told Jihai everything. Then her earpiece reported an enemy scout in District 3's alley, outside sniper range. Support had to be awaited. She lowered her bow and wondered if he still saw her as a child, as if he was the only one who had changed. A young enemy stood on the next roof. She said her aim was fine, but the coordinator warned the target was beyond the 300-meter limit. Yoon Sol heard that even for a sniper, making that shot with a competition bow should be impossible. Stepping onto the edge despite their protests, she said it was fine. She'd handle them herself. She drew the bow and loaded a skill into the shot. An alert came in right as she released. The arrow flew with a loaded aim skill and martial technique stacked into it. The shot raced toward the enemy. It struck him square in the chest. Chien was eliminated. Calmly standing on the roof, the black-haired girl reported a successful hit and was praised right away. With a proud look, she told her brother not to underestimate her. She remembered sitting alone by a wall while adults talked about how she might be left with no family and no one to care for her. When they said they couldn't even find her older brother's body, she clenched her fists and thought he wasn't dead. Thinking of the accident and her dead parents, she convinced herself Appa was still alive. Seeing his untouched seat, she believed he'd appear in front of her soon. Then, in that moment of despair, something strange appeared before her. On the TV, a deity announced that nightmare days were coming very soon. The blonde figure folded her hands and called on humanity to grow stronger. With empty eyes, the girl looked up, while everyone else panicked, wondering what this even was. To her, it was a revelation. A goddess speaking of monsters, dungeons, and hunters as this absurd world became real. And through all of it, she believed her brother would come back. After passing her hunter aptitude test, she got the archer class and entered the hunter academy. There, someone dumped milk over her head. One punk threw a bag at her and mocked her, asking if being an orphan tasted good. Hands grabbed at her gear while someone sneered, asking if she was jealous. A purple-haired boy laughed the loudest, saying his family paid a fortune for the academy while she got in for free. A second later, she smashed a tray into his face with all her strength. Yoon Seal rose from her seat and told them that if they were so jealous, they could become orphans too. And when they insulted her again, she glared at them, cursed, and told them to follow her if they were really that brave. They went silent and stared in fear. She remembered the blue wolf attacking her and thought about how she still made it through the academy. After that, the top guild Dawn, one everyone wanted to join, found her. The beast bit down on her bow, and she struggled to fight it off. Reaching for a broken arrow, she thought, had she really suffered this long just to run into a bastard like this? Then she drove the shard through the monster's head. Hatred burned in her eyes as the monster collapsed in blood. Jae found her there and said, a little surprised, that she came to help, but seeing Yoon Shil covered in blood, she added that maybe help wasn't needed. Smiling, the yellow-eyed girl asked if she was new and what her name was. The hero's sister answered with clear distrust. The killer held out her hand and said she had eyes full of fire, that she'd grow strong, and that she should remember her name. That was when Yoon Shil caught the deputy's attention, and later became the youngest guild leader. A displeased guy guy stood behind her with folded arms, and she knew Jungyun wasn't the only one unhappy about it. She remembered all the work she put in, and thought that being a team leader, even leading Dawn, was fun, because she wanted to get stronger. Again and again she pulled arrows back, rubbing her hands raw until they bled so she could survive on her own. The black-haired girl kept sharpening her archery, refusing to let weak thoughts creep in, and snapped herself back into focus. Every arrow hit the center. Now the hero's sister picked up the pendant with a sad look. Inside was a photo of the two of them together, and she quietly stared at it. As she tucked it away, she muttered that this wasn't praise for her. Her brother was the problem, because he stayed with Jae-hee. Staring ahead, she admitted that compared to an opponent skilled in martial arts, she was still lacking something. Then she raised her bow and shouted that she wouldn't forgive him for treating her like a child. She wasn't that weak. Suddenly, a heavy silence fell over the place. Looking around, the blue-eyed girl realized it had gotten far too quiet. She spoke into her earpiece, nervously saying code Ayla. She was leaving her spot and moving to a new one, then repeated her question. A red aura suddenly appeared in front of her, and a storm of arrows rained in from behind. One arrow pierced her hand, and right after that, someone yelled for everyone to stop firing. 4 people stood on the opposite roof as a report came in that the target had been found. The enemy wore a cruel grin. She realized the muscles were fine, but the skin had still been pierced, and that shouldn't happen with blunt arrowheads. Blood dripped from her hand as she realized they were using real arrows. One of them dropped down and told her not to expect rescue. They had already dealt with the signal, so no broadcast camera could reach the spot. The black-haired girl just smiled and said she never counted on help anyway. Still smiling, she yanked the arrow from her hand and said she'd never relied on something like that in her life. She tossed the arrow aside and asked why they were causing all this trouble, just to catch one person. Then, the black-haired girl set 3 arrows on the bow at once. Aiming through the bow, she coldly told them they were already dead, and said to start. Right away, they gave the order to kill her. She looked up and saw a rain of arrows coming down. They were insanely fast, so she had to react right now. She leaped up at once and avoided the hit. Then she drew her bow and used her archer skill. That triggered the scattered arrows, sending them flying in every direction. One after another, her enemies were killed or badly wounded. She jumped back and realized one enemy was still left, because her injured hand had thrown her off. He stared at her in shock, thinking she had taken down 3 people from such an unstable position. He frowned, unable to believe a sniper could do that much damage up close, even if they were using match arrows too. He ran through the archer types in his head. Snipers for long range, shooters for targeting key spots, and rangers who shine in close combat thanks to speed. Like rock paper scissors, each class counters another, which meant a team made only of rangers was a terrible choice for taking down a sniper like her. Meanwhile, the brunette moved through the air and thought, thankfully, it didn't hurt much. She just had to finish the rest. Then another enemy suddenly appeared nearby. She shifted aside and landed. Dodging the strike, she used her sniper skill again. Her arrow shot straight at the enemy. He barely dodged it, but she had used that same boomerang shot, and the arrow quickly curved back around. By the time he touched the ground, it was already too late. He looked up and started cursing her, but he never noticed the arrow coming from behind. It pierced his back and killed him almost instantly. His body dropped to the ground at once. The brunette frowned, realizing what she had just done. Another opponent was waiting right in front of her. They locked eyes, both fully ready to fight, but then another enemy showed up on her left. The young man fired almost at once. The arrow came at terrifying speed, nearly reaching her before she turned and spotted it. In that instant, her brother's words about martial arts flashed through her mind, and she understood. A second power awakened inside her, and she caught the arrow with one hand. Her opponent was completely stunned and couldn't understand what he was seeing, but she rushed him right away and swung hard. One blow was enough to kill him. He fell, and she immediately turned to the last one. Smiling, she asked what they should do now that only one survivor was left. The brunette facing her said he could save his last words because they planned to beat everything out of him, but instead, he surrendered. Then the dispatcher said he'd support her and activated code 1. At that same moment, an arrow was already flying toward the back of her head. 3 people appeared on the rooftop, and the dispatcher said that was good work. She looked up and said she got his message, but the help came a little late. He apologized. Watching through the camera, the commentator announced that the archer had survived round 6. Dawn had won, and no one really understood what had just happened. Then her teammates landed, while the news reported that something abnormal had happened in the broadcast zone. The hunter had taken down 4 Twilight players. Her face made it clear she was thrilled. The watchers on the side said it was unbelievable, and that the brunette was seriously strong, but she had been like that from the start. Then she closed her eyes, said she didn't need help if possible, and activated her sniper skill. She looked up, used clairvoyance, and said she made it through, then thanked her brother. At that moment, a helicopter passed overhead. Her older brother was inside, pleased by what he'd seen. His girlfriend looked at him and asked if he saw it. He coughed and said he saw everything. Then he added that his sister got through that crisis thanks to the martial arts he taught her, but that wasn't really the point. Turning to her with a smile, he said he was joking. She was right. He really didn't know her anymore. He still remembered her as a little kid, so seeing her grown up and this strong left him confused. Thinking back to her childish laugh, he admitted he couldn't keep treating her like a little girl. He went quiet, then said that was exactly what he should expect from his sister. He was cut off and asked how he could talk so openly about martial arts. Looking down, she added that they were lucky the broadcast had problems. A drone was nearby too, and they had agreed that if that person had seen them, things would have gone badly. But the truth was, that man had been watching the whole time. He got angry and said that movement was most likely martial arts. Later, everyone moved to the amusement park. There, a girl asked how her brother really felt about his sister being so strong. He started thinking, but she quickly pointed out the answer was obvious, and that he should at least open the bottle if he was pretending to drink. The brunette looked away and said that compared to the strongest immortal in the universe or whatever, she was still lacking. Without martial arts, she wouldn't have reached the finals, and her inner energy was almost gone too. In the end, she would have lost. She was surprised when she heard that wasn't true. Her brother set the bottle down and told her she was strong because of her own hard work, both her martial arts and her hunter skills. He lowered his head and apologized for hiding so much. He wanted to be her brother like before, but some things got in the way. He pictured her as a baby and said he still saw her as that tiny innocent sister from the past, when really she had grown up and become far more mature. She listened in silence. Then, she said that all this time, she wanted to find the person who had made their family this way. That was why she became a hunter. She explained that she thought if she reached the top as an archer, she might find at least one clue, but before she knew it, she was completely swallowed by that life. Lowering her head, she said it all felt strangely simple at the time, and that was how she ended up here. Then she held out her little finger and said the past was the past. She only wanted one promise from him, never leave her again. He said that was obvious, but she looked at him from under her brows and said it wasn't obvious at all. Raising her eyes, she said lately he had been hiding things from her, and it made her feel alone. There was no reason to keep secrets from her anymore. He listened carefully, then he smiled and said he understood. He hooked his little finger with hers and promised he would never leave her alone again. Then he added there was something else she needed to know, and she immediately asked what it was. Smiling, he told her his nickname wasn't some immortal whoever, it was Immortal Emperor of the Sword. She was stunned. The girl completely froze. Then a loudspeaker announced that the great battle would begin in 1 hour, and told everyone to head to the starting area, repeating the warning again. Her brother got up and said he had to go. She told him to do his best, then asked if he was seriously going dressed like that for an official event. He turned back, surprised, and said it was comfortable. Then he asked if Cha thought those attackers were strange, since it looked like they had targeted her on purpose. She remembered them right away, and said dawn and dusk sometimes clash in dungeons, but this time they attacked her openly, which really was strange. Then she smugly said, they met people like that all the time. They probably just wanted to get rid of a Dawn pro fast. Her brother thought she'd definitely brag about that later. He thought it over, and heard that if that was true, then it was actually good. But in her head, the same warning echoed again, that everything would be taken from him once more. Sometime later, he arrived at the stadium, where a man greeted him and said he had heard a lot about him from the deputy head. They shook hands, and the man said he'd be taking the vanguard in the great battle. He was looking forward to it, and was glad to finally meet him. Then he turned and asked how the others were doing. While the man spoke with the others, MC quietly asked his girlfriend if this was the same leader they had been talking about. She told him not to underestimate the guy. He was a top level 60 hunter. MC just pointed out that even so, he was still weaker than her, and she agreed. Then the brown-haired man walked over, said he was heading out, and wished her luck getting ready for the match. he took that as a sign that the man wouldn't be using martial arts in the battle. The protagonist smiled to himself, remembering that true martial arts can look just like magic. He also felt grateful to his girlfriend. She looked surprised when he thanked her for making up with her sister. Then she smiled, answered him, and wished them both good luck. The brunette smiled back. Soon, some people came up to Cha and asked if he was really the one they'd heard so much about from the deputy leader, the talented hunter chosen to lead the vanguard. They were clearly impressed, but MC barely paid attention. His mind was still on the men who attacked his sister. The more he thought about it, the clearer it felt they had to be acting on someone's orders, and only one person fit. A moment later, that person showed up. It was the leader of the Twilight Guild. Smiling, he joked that he had interrupted their break. He stared at him through the crowd, thinking that if the one who contacted him was a heavenly warrior, then this man, someone under that side, might be involved too. The guild leader stepped closer and casually asked what was wrong. Wasn't this just a friendly match? He had only come to say hello. The others answered coldly that nothing about their guilds was friendly. The guild leader just smiled. Then he spread his hands and admitted they were right. He said he'd heard a remarkable man would be here, so he came to take a look for himself. He moved up to Cha and said he'd heard a lot about him and was glad to meet him. Still smiling, he added that this was their first time meeting. The protagonist looked at him for a moment, then shook his hand and agreed. Yes, this was their first meeting. As he watched the man, MC thought about the heavenly harmony of pure art. It still gave him no answer. If this wasn't that man's doing, then where had his sister learned martial arts? That thought brought him back to her. Could someone who had never been to Murim really master martial arts? Cha also glanced at the man's assistant and said he recognized one of the workers. It had been a long time since they last met. The assistant stiffened a little when he mentioned that he had once tried to get closer through the secretary, but that talk had gone nowhere. Then the protagonist looked back at the guild leader and brought up the archer's battle, saying his sister had caused Twilight's hunters a lot of trouble. The man replied that he had been meaning to mention that. Her skills were as impressive as expected. MC frowned and warned him not to forget it, because he would make him pay. The leader only answered with a mocking smile, saying he was terrified and would look forward to it. Turning away, he told him to do exactly that. At the same time, he wondered whether Summer was tied to the heavenly warrior or not. That was the second issue. First came the fact that they had touched his sister. As he left, Xiao Pei said he'd put on a show the man would never forget. In his heart, he was already set on wiping away that debt for good. The whole stadium erupted in cheers. The commentator shouted that the crowd had been waiting a long time for this. Everyone listened as the announcers built up the day's main event of the Sun Festival. A female commentator stood and declared that the great battle between Dawn and Twilight was finally about to begin. The whole crowd was eager for the fight. When Xiao stepped onto the field, the commentator introduced him as Dawn's representative, a super rookie who had drawn huge attention after receiving a personal partnership offer from Dawn's deputy leader. They added that he was the head of the martial arts guild, Hunter Shin Hyun. The female commentator grabbed her partner in excitement and said this was the first time someone outside the guild had entered the great battle. Who was he, and why had Dawn invited him? No one knew. Her partner explained that his level, class, and achievements were all hidden. Since nothing was known about him, that mystery alone could put pressure on the enemy. Then he introduced the protagonist's opponent, the head of Twilight's vanguard. The man stepped out and said the rumors were true. The protagonist really did have an arrogant face. The commentators called him Twilight's genius mage, the fire dragon's flame. Walking forward, he declared that he would burn MC to ashes. He only smirked. He couldn't tell if those titles were supposed to be serious. In Murim, names like that might sound normal, but here, they just felt embarrassing. As the two stared each other down, the commentators announced the start of the first match of the great battle. Then the bell rang. Meanwhile, the head of Twilight smiled to himself, thinking that his man knew exactly what to do. He kept watching and thought Xiao couldn't be allowed to leave alive. At the very least, they needed to force out all of his abilities. His subordinates backed off, remembering who was in command. Then confusion spread through the arena. His opponent was suddenly flying overhead. Even the commentator was stunned, saying the protagonist had revealed his class right away. Levitation was a sorcerer skill. As MC hovered high above the field, the female commentator said he had openly shown a high-ranked class. On top of that, keeping that height proved amazing magic control. Was this really his plan? A man beside her turned and asked if she thought Xiao Pei some strategy. After thinking a moment, she said no. It looked more like he simply wanted to do it. Still floating in the air, he judged his opponent as a level 50 wizard. From what he could tell, the man was around the same level as his last opponent. The protagonist remembered that earlier fight and thought that if he used martial arts, this enemy wouldn't stand a chance. But if he fought only with hunter skills, things would be different. He was level 53 now. He lowered his gaze and admitted to himself that even though his power had raised his level fast, he still lacked real experience as a hunter. Then he looked toward the guild leader and realized there was another reason for this. The man was watching him closely. So Cha smiled and said to himself that the man really was studying him. He must want to learn more. Raising his hand, MC activated his power and thought that the man could stare for 100 years until his eyes dried out. He still wouldn't see what he wanted. At once, he launched a barrage at his opponent. As the other man tried to defend himself, the commentator yelled that countless energy spheres were raining down on him. He threw up a fire barrier, but it barely held. From below, the man frowned and thought these were just basic, attribute-free mana spheres. Was Cha only testing him? He fired back, and the commentator shouted that Twilight's hunter had finally countered, swinging blazing fire like a whip at his enemy. The wizard frowned even more. The protagonist was a sorcerer, but he was clearly hiding something. In this world, there were only 3 kinds of magic classes. Some magicians focused on non-combat work, making skill cubes and items. Those were artisans. Wizards specialized in battle by giving mana special attributes. Sorcerers, though, were something else entirely, more like people with supernatural powers, using abilities like teleportation and flight. He pictured that kind of sorcerer, and remembered that they usually stayed in the rear, acting in support and only stepping in when their strange powers were needed most. But standing back and watching wasn't his style, so he rushed in to attack again. Firing up his flames, he shouted that if Cha had a trump card, now was the time to use it. As he struck, he warned that otherwise MC would have to feel his heat. He quickly shielded his face with his hands and frowned slightly. Then, the blow slammed him into the ground. The commentator shouted in shock that the flames had exploded on impact. Just what you'd expect from the fire dragon's flame, an incredible mix of fire magic and raw strength. The crowd was stunned, and the commentators added that this hunter was famous for a close-range fighting style, something rare for a mage, which made the battle even more interesting. Still, Cha lowered his head and muttered that he had thought he was the only mage from Murim. Then he rose and added that this man's way of thinking felt a little too similar to his own, and that put him in a bad mood. His opponent stood across from him, listening closely the whole time. Then he formed another fire sphere, and warned the protagonist one more time. If he didn't want to end up crawling on the ground, he should start fighting for real. With that, he activated his special skill. A massive pillar of fire shot toward MC. His opponent shouted that it was time for Cha to show everything he had, was holding back with the fire dragon march. A giant fire dragon rushed straight at him. He just smiled and said his opponent wanted a trump card. So fine, he'd get one. Then he lowered one finger, and everyone froze in shock. Blue energy appeared in front of the fire dragon. His opponent stared and blurted out, "Who is this lunatic?" That insane power had just stopped a major attack. Even the commentators were stunned, asking what they had just seen. Looking at the wrecked arena, they said it was unbelievable. He seemed to dodge with incredible speed, but how did he survive that blast? The crowd was just as confused. The commentator said it almost looked like he got swallowed, but none of it made sense. Then a huge blue flame beast appeared above him. He had cast it perfectly with nothing but a finger snap. At that moment, a man turned to Jahe and asked what the hell happened, but she walked away. She was thinking that no one could really tell the difference between his power and magic. He had fooled almost everyone. Even when he claimed he didn't understand it either, she knew that wasn't true. The guild leader was watching from his seat nearby, and he was furious. His protege was still in the arena, and now people were saying even Fire Dragon March had failed against the main character. He couldn't understand it. How could his special move not work? That made the guy even madder. He formed another attack and shouted that this bastard needed to die. But the brunette lifted a hand and made a shield in one smooth move. Then he mocked him, asking why he was so upset. Did he want a little lesson to feel better? His opponent jumped back at once and shot into the air. He came back down, slammed the ground, and yelled at him to shut up. As he rushed into close combat, the commentator said he was unleashing a furious combo, but the main character was handling it easily and blocking everything. One fighter was raging, the other looked amused, and the commentators loved it. Who expected two magicians to end up brawling like this? At last his opponent stopped, confused, when he heard that he had done well, but made one mistake that ruined the brunette's mood. The brunette pressed a point on his leg and said he was still too inexperienced. If he was going to open himself up like that, his balance should stay in his legs, not leave the ground so carelessly. The opponent was thrown away and crashed down hard. The guy added that he also needed to fix his bad habit of lifting his shoulders too much when striking, and pay closer attention to his enemy. The red-haired young man looked up and asked how he did that, then asked again. He stepped closer and leaned in, saying he'd been training in martial arts for a long time. Then he bent down even more and said the other guy just lacked real experience. Almost face to face now, he asked if he really thought he understood everything. Did he actually believe his current power was enough? Then he hit him where it hurt most, saying those pathetic techniques alone were nowhere near enough, and that he was weak. The main character looked surprised when his opponent started threatening to turn him to ashes. The young man forced himself back up and covered his body in flames. The brunette barely managed to leap away. His opponent screamed that even if it took every last bit of strength, he would burn him to ash. Then fire dragons appeared all around him again. This time he was using his true power. The furious fire dragon marched charged straight at the brunette. He stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next. Then he smiled and said it looked like he'd have to use a little more strength. After all, this one was actually strong. Fire swallowed the whole arena. The commentators shouted that this attack could burn down the entire stadium. Fire dragons were flying everywhere, and now the brunette would really have to work to defend himself. The girl stepped back and said the flames had spread through the stadium like an explosion. It was getting dangerously hot. The young man's girlfriend watched closely as people said her comrade had cornered him. What could he possibly use against such a brutal attack? But then something changed. The girl was completely shocked. Right in front of her, the brunette blocked the attack with a single move. It was unbelievable. Even that massive assault couldn't break his barrier. He stood there smiling, saying it was annoying, but attacks like this weren't that hard to stop. Then he spread his arms and said that as long as his body couldn't die and felt neither heat nor cold, taking him down would not be easy. Even so, the fire dragons kept pushing forward. Everything was still burning, even though the attack had been stopped. A second later, an explosion went off, and the flames suddenly began to fade. The brunette lowered his finger again and said that pathetic attack couldn't even touch him. He had really come through it without a scratch. The commentators yelled that he had wiped out that terrifying power in an instant and crushed all those fire dragons with ease. Everyone was stunned, shouting that this power was unbelievable. Was he really controlling gravity? His opponent dropped to the ground and muttered that this was nonsense. Then he looked up at him, while the commentators wondered if his magic had always been this overwhelming. Even for people used to fights like this, it was something new. His power was beyond belief. Could a beginner really control gravity that well? Meanwhile, the guy walked closer and said this fight had been more fun than he expected. He aimed his energy at his opponent and said it was time to finish it. Then he struck hard. The red-haired young man was blasted backward. He crashed down hard, and his opponent smiled, saying it was definitely over now. At that moment, the guild head asked his assistant who was next. The answer came back. The knight. He said that was perfect. With a cold smile, he told the assistant to go tell him to use it. This was Xiao Yum, the Spear of Twilight who protected them. His spear erased opponents right from the start of battle. Finally, the knight stepped into the ring, and the commentators introduced him as the Spear of Twilight, the Mage Killer. A girl turned and excitedly said that with a nickname like that, he must have never lost. Someone else added that war-type fighters usually beat magicians more often, though magicians can still hide tricks no one knows about. The main character stood across from him and studied his new opponent. Then he stretched his arms and asked if this was really the Mage Killer. He said he was looking forward to the fight, and that the guy had a nice suit too. The guild head smiled to himself, thinking this guy was way too relaxed. This time would be different. The knight activated his power at once, and the commentator announced the second duel of the Sun Festival. His support skills were already boosting his body. He swung his weapon and charged forward. Then he threw the first attack, and a girl explained that right from the start, the knight had stacked every physical buff he could, and rushed straight in. The main character smiled and asked if he was really trying to break through head on. He admitted it was pretty fast. Then he gathered energy and said he didn't care. He fired a projectile and mocked him, saying he looked like an easy dummy to beat. His magic spheres exploded across the field. Even so, the knight pushed right through them. He closed the distance in an instant, catching the guy off guard. The main character had to jump back right away to avoid the strike. Looking up, he realized the knight wasn't just fast, he was strong too, and had serious willpower. Against someone like that, fighting from the air would be best. At the same time, the knight drove his spear into the floor and activated a skill. Then he swung and leaped toward the main character. The brunette clearly hadn't expected that. A second attack came down from above. He managed to raise a barrier, but even that got pierced. An explosion followed, and the commentators called the attack incredible. The knight wasn't giving him any chance to take the air. He kept pressing without hesitation, and the arena staff would have a nightmare fixing all this damage. Meanwhile, the main character was down on the ground, wondering what had just happened and how he got slammed into the floor that badly. The knight wasn't slowing down at all. He ran at him again. Finally, the young man got up and said that if he could use martial arts, he'd finish this in a second. He also called the bastard stubborn, because the knight was already charging again. Then he raised his hand, his eyes glowing, and said the other guy probably wanted to see this. After that, he lowered one finger. But something strange happened. The head of the Twilight Guild calmly sipped his drink, while the commentator said the hunter had used that unknown skill again. For the first time since the round began, the knight stopped moving. Then the man paused mid-drink when he heard the commentator's shock. The knight started moving again. He had resisted the magic and was rising back up. Then he lifted his glowing eyes and stared at his opponent. A pillar of magic trapped him, but it still didn't stop him. Even under that crushing pressure, he forced himself up and kept moving. The main character heard him say, "You really thought your gravity could stop me? Now it's my turn." The knight charged straight at him, yelling for him to get ready. Cha stared at him, confused, wondering what he meant. Then he waved a hand and asked when he had ever used gravity. For a second, the knight didn't get it. Then he was blasted backward at crazy speed and slammed into the wall. That hit drained almost everything he had left. It looked like the match was over. The whole crowd froze, including the guild leader, who clearly never saw this coming. Even the commentators were lost. They first guessed it was gravity again, then corrected themselves. No, this was some other force, strong enough to crush even the knight. As Che stood there, they kept asking what skill he had just used. He walked up to his opponent and admitted the kid was tough. Lasting this long had already been surprising. Hands in his pockets, he explained that his power wasn't gravity, it was attraction and repulsion. His main skill, earned through hard work, called yin and yang conductivity. A status screen popped up with details. This was a top-level treasure, so rare people barely believed it existed. It let the user add attraction or repulsion to magical power, without outside magical effects. Che lifted a small pebble and said that if the knight knew basic physics, he'd get it. Attraction pulls things in, repulsion pushes them away. The full explanation was long, but that was the idea. Then he flicked the pebble toward the knight's head. Closing one eye, the protagonist started to explain that he could apply force in any direction he wanted, but the knight cut him off and said he was wrong. The knight got back up and warned that MC never should have revealed his weakness. Then he reached out with a mocking look and used his real skill. Everyone watching was stunned. Now it was starting to make sense why the knight was known as a mage killer. A girl watched in fear and realized the knight had a special ability. If her ally relied only on magic, he was done, and she was right. Sha suddenly couldn't do anything. That outstretched hand looked like a death sentence. The guild leader finally smiled and said the guy was going to die right there, but Jae panicked and shouted, asking if this was really happening. A status window flashed in front of him. It said a counterspell had been used, blocking magic for 10 seconds. As the knight lifted his axe over him, Sha still didn't understand what was happening. Before the match, someone had gone to the knight and told him to use counterspell on the leader's order. The knight turned and said he hated using that skill in public, so why push it this far? The leader's assistant answered that the boss believed this man was hiding something. He didn't know what, but a sorcerer with attraction powers was too dangerous, so he had to die. He said it with a smile. Back in the arena, Chao looked at his enemy and thought it was over. Shaken, he asked what this even was. The knight rushed him with his spear. The strike landed right beside him, and the protagonist barely escaped. Still smiling, the knight said MC looked surprised. This was his true skill, counterspell. It shut down magic for a while, so the fight was finished. Hearing that he had no chance without magic, Chao was knocked aside. The stands erupted, and the commentators called it a shocking twist. Just when when the fight seemed over, the knight's strange skill had completely suppressed the hunter. The guild leader smirked and said the knight was simple and honest by nature. He'd never stay calm against someone who attacked from the shadows with magic. He added that even he had never dreamed of getting a skill like that. And the girl turned and cried that this couldn't be real. Terrified, she thought he needed to run now. The tournament didn't matter anymore. He had to surrender. He was told not to use martial arts, but Che wondered if he really should run or give up. The knight closed in, saying no, that wasn't happening. He swung again and said he wouldn't be able to dodge or surrender, while building up power for the next attack. With blazing eyes, he said the tip of his spear now held enough force to destroy a whole house. He wanted to see if the protagonist could survive without magic shielding him. Then he kicked off the ground. He swung down and wished him dead. Cha looked up and wondered if this was really how he would die. The knight struck at once, but MC stared back with burning eyes and muttered, "What kind of nonsense is this?" Then he released a huge burst of energy. Everyone around him felt it and had no idea what it was. Some men turned to the deputy leader and asked what was wrong. Why were they suddenly clutching their heads? The guild leader held his own head and thought that the heavenly harmony of pure art had started to react. But this energy was different from anything he had ever felt. Even while the knight kept pressing forward, the leader realized these waves of power were massive and terrifying, and the knight couldn't handle them either. Suddenly he screamed. Then he froze, wondering how this was possible. Was it magic? No. The counterspell was still active, and yet he was trapped by some kind of binding force. Hanging in the air, he shouted, asking what kind of skill this was. Cha appeared in front of him and said it wasn't a skill, it was martial arts. If he wanted details, he could ask his leader later. The knight could only repeat the question in shock. Still glaring at him, he said he'd almost ended up the same way a few minutes ago, and he hated being told to run. Looking at the knight, he noticed how stunned he was. It seemed only this man could truly see and feel that power. The protagonist went on to explain that the force binding his body came from a sword art called the spiritual sword, something you could use after reaching the 40th inner level. Even though it was called swordsmanship, the sword really meant human will. Then he moved closer. He drew an invisible sword and said that at this level, a mere thought could kill people, or split heaven and earth. With a smile, he said ending things plainly would be too boring. Then the chains around the knight began to tighten and move. When he dropped to the ground, Shai told him someone had to teach the younger ones a lesson. Then he drove a full power strike into the knight's chest. The knight coughed up blood, and MC seemed satisfied. As he flung him away, he thought the leader should watch closely now, as much as he wanted. He smiled, thinking these were the real martial arts he wanted to see. Then he leaped up and unleashed a whirlwind strike. The knight's body shot into the air. The pressure was so brutal, his bones audibly cracked. The leader was stunned, and the commentators shouted in confusion. They had thought the strange power was stopped, but now everything had turned again. The knight couldn't fight back anymore. When the protagonist landed, his bloodied opponent crashed down behind him. The commentators wondered if this was tied to the energy pouring from the protagonist's body. MC looked pretty satisfied. The commentators declared the duel over and called for the medical team, while he casually said that felt refreshing. He hadn't used martial arts in a long time. He won the duel, and the guild leader took the loss. The commentators announced him as the winner of the second match of the great battle at the Sun Festival. After that, he refused to keep fighting, saying his mana was spent. In the matches that followed, Twilight lost 3-2, and the festival came to an end. News spread fast. This time, neither Twilight nor Dawn claimed the Sun Festival. Instead, martial arts stole the spotlight. He quickly became a star among hunters, while Twilight's reputation took a major hit, and people argued about it all over the comments. After that, the guild leader shut himself in his room. His assistant came over and asked if he was okay. He waited by the door for a long time, but got no answer. Down below, the man just sat there laughing. To him, the whole situation was hilarious. He replayed all the emotions he had felt, and said he'd had enough fear. Now it had all been washed away. Then he picked up his jacket and thought that brief moment had shown a level of power he couldn't handle. What the guy displayed was beyond him. Putting the jacket on, he admitted it. Maybe he couldn't beat him right now, but that only meant he needed to act. Smiling, he added that there was no reason left to hide his methods. As he walked out, he told the assistant they were leaving, asked where they were going, and the brunette smiled. To see the heavenly warrior, of course. A week passed after the Sun Festival. The phone operators kept saying the same thing. Everything was a mess, and they were repeating themselves non-stop. This was happening at Dawn headquarters. Callers kept saying they wanted to speak to the hunter and get martial arts guild contact info. One operator finally snapped, repeating that the main character was not part of Dawn. He belonged to the martial arts guild. Then he lost his temper and yelled into the phone that the rumors about the deputy guild leader dating the hunter were complete nonsense, and demanded to know which idiot kept calling. The shouting was so loud it could even be heard in the conference room, where the deputy guild leader and Che were sitting. The secretary stood beside them, with his head down, and reported that they had gotten 328 calls and 800 emails, meant for the martial arts guild. More exactly, for guild leader Shin Hyun. Most were from reporters or people wanting to join. The girl quietly drank her tea as he went on. Besides that, there were 8 partnership requests, 42 ad offers, and 29 filming proposals. The protagonist listened closely. Out of all those offers, only one had been accepted. Just then, someone knocked and apologized for interrupting, saying the chief secretary urgently needed to see something. The man looked up and said he would end the report there. Upset, he headed for the door, wondering what had happened this time. The girl set down her tea and said that was the situation, then asked what it felt like to suddenly become a superstar. Chow let out a breath and said he didn't exactly hate being famous, but all the hype made him uncomfortable. Then he asked for the secretary's name, saying he should thank him. The deputy head listened carefully. After a pause, she raised her head and said this apology was late. When he asked what for, she explained that she had asked him to surrender because she didn't want his identity exposed back then. She admitted it was rude, and worse, she hadn't even considered his opinion. She apologized again, saying she had been too anxious. Lowering her head, she added that if they had made the wrong move, everyone could have ended up in danger. Che stood up and told her she was overthinking it. Did she really believe he'd be hurt by something that small? Then he lowered his voice and said, sure, it was annoying, but he hadn't wanted to use martial arts anyway. And even if the Twilight Guild leader learned the truth, what could he really do? MC reminded her that he had met him that day. For now, that man's limit was simply realizing how far behind he was, and he'd probably stay quiet for a while. Looking around, he added that the moment he thought about the guy aiming for his sister, he wanted to strangle him. The deputy clearly liked hearing that. Then she bowed and said it was true. Twilight's public activity had dropped a lot after the festival. She had expected him to pressure Dawn hard, but it seemed the shock hit him deeply. From what she knew, he had shut himself inside his house, and veteran hunters who had stayed neutral were now coming to Dawn instead. She reached out her hand and said that gave Dawn a real advantage, and it was all thanks to him. Smiling, she added that she wanted to thank him properly, officially, as the deputy head of Dawn, to the head of the martial arts guild. Che smiled, then said she finally sounded like herself again. He shook her hand and told her he'd be counting on her from now on. Then he picked up his phone and said enough time had passed. It was time to go, since his sister was waiting. She immediately looked at the stack of papers and asked why he had accepted only the invitation from the Jeju Island Guild Union. Why that one, and why reject all the others? As he was leaving, the protagonist said he was tired of dungeons, and his level wasn't going up much either. Then he smiled and added there was another reason. Jeju was a perfect place for a family trip. On his way out, he said he'd be back in about a month, and they could meet again then. Che trusted that girl, or maybe he just trusted himself too much. If he had known what was coming, he never would have gone to that island. The last thing he saw was her smile. Sometime later, they arrived at Jeju International Airport. MC's sister walked along happily, clearly excited. She turned around and said they had really come. Then she looked around and said it was her first time here. What should they eat first? Black pork or perch? He followed behind with a smile and asked if she really liked it that much. Still, this wasn't just a fun trip. Suddenly, something caught his attention, and someone shouted loudly. It was a representative from the Island Guild Union and the Tamra Guild. Their greeting was pretty strange. Honestly, it looked a little silly. The two of them were so thrown off they couldn't even answer right away. Che turned and said it might be better to go rest somewhere, mainly to get away from them. But the guild leader quickly caught up and stepped in front of them. Then he grabbed the protagonist's hand. He shook it with all his strength, introduced himself as the guild leader, and thanked them for accepting the invitation. The girl behind him couldn't believe he was the leader. He looked younger than she was. Then he leaned in and said he had loved MC's fight at the Sun Festival. It was a little embarrassing, but he had become a fan right then. He asked for an autograph later, saying he had even bought a t-shirt for MC to sign. MC started thinking maybe he should just turn around and leave. Then the guild leader turned to his sister and asked if she was really the Dawn group leader, and also his sister. He greeted her warmly. At that moment, an assistant rushed over and said they were running out of time. The young man turned and said he had completely forgotten. He started hurrying them along, saying things were moving too fast, but there was somewhere they had to go first. He promised to explain everything on the way. The protagonist looked at him and said he understood. Maybe they should just let him go on ahead. But the answer came back that their schedule was packed. The leader kept talking, saying since it was their first time here, he would show them all the best places later. At that moment, someone nearby watched them and reported over the radio in Chinese that the main character had arrived. On the other end, a man with glasses said that if he was in Korea, he should speak Korean. Did he really want to expose himself? An apology came right away. Then the man stood up from his lounge chair. On the sand, he said the sweet break was over. With a dozen guards around him, he started walking and said it was time to work. Then he took off his glasses and said, "Welcome to the trap." Meanwhile, Chaz's group kept moving. Soon, the group reached the headquarters on Jeju Island. There, they were greeted by the leader of the island side. The man shook MC's hand and introduced himself as Kim Hee-jun, leader of the MC Guild, saying he was very glad to meet him. He added that they had come a long way, so he hoped they wouldn't refuse Jeju's special treat. Then he told his nephew to bring it quickly, and the boy agreed. When they heard it was a local specialty, the girl's eyes lit up. She wondered what it could be. Black pork maybe, or perch. The boy smiled and said that once someone tasted this delicacy, they would never forget it. Then he opened the tray and proudly said he was presenting a first-class, fresh, carefully chosen tangerine. The girl froze for a second, totally caught off guard. Then she reached for her bow, but her brother stopped her and said she just needed to be patient a little longer. While she peeled the tangerine, they apologized for bringing up work right after the trip, saying the situation gave them no choice. The man looked at Cha and explained that the island's hunters were mainly under local control, but two major outside groups, Dawn and Twilight, were also involved. Because of that, they chose to build their own independent organization. He talked about those two guilds and said they might soon take over Jeju completely. They had been targeting the island for a long time. Then he explained that Tamar Guild had played a key part in running Jeju up to this point. That lasted only until high-risk dungeons started showing up far too often and in large numbers. This year alone, 5 level 11 or higher dungeons appeared on the island, something that had never happened before. And dungeons that dangerous can only be cleared by guilds with veteran hunters above level 40. He lowered his head and admitted Tamar can't join dungeon raids right now. They don't have any veteran hunters, and every strong hunter on the island already belongs to Dawn or Dusk. Cha frowned and asked what the issue was. If dungeons kept appearing, couldn't they just leave them alone for now? He figured the monsters probably couldn't come out on their own, but they quickly told him that was impossible. The man stepped in close and shouted that if Tamar stopped protecting the dungeons, they'd lose that right completely. Dawn and Dusk would take over, and once that happened, Tamar would never get it back. He said he finally understood. The men grabbed their heads, nearly crying, and said they'd fought so hard to keep those two guilds from taking over. If they kept doing nothing, Jeju Island would be lost to outsiders. Then he looked up and said they had already given up hope and fallen into despair, but not. Then he pointed at the protagonist and called him their last ray of hope. They went on praising him, a high-rank hunter with no guild, officially neutral, the one who could save Tamra and help them keep their ground on the island. They even shouted that he was perfect, a new wave of hunter who could outshine everyone else. The brunette just stared, thinking these people had to be crazy. The guild leader gazed at MC with shining eyes and thanked him from the bottom of his heart for coming. MC shut that down right away. He hadn't come out of kindness. He was here to level up and make money. After that, he stood up and said that if the talk was finished, they should head to the dungeon right away. But his sister stopped him and told him to wait. She gave him a serious look and said there was one problem they had to deal with first. Cha tensed and asked what she meant, and the brunette looked him in the eye and said black pork and perch were waiting for them. Sometime later, a fight was already underway in one of the unduns when a sudden explosion went off. The hunters below were struggling to hold back the monsters. One of them gripped his spear and said their attacks meant nothing. The enemies were way too fast. Their opponents were fire poison monkeys, and those creatures could make huge fireballs and launch them straight at the guild members. The team barely dodged and realized they needed to fall back fast. Then, one of them felt something hit him. The young man turned and asked if it was poison. He had heard these monsters were toxic, but he didn't expect them to be this strong too. He threw up another barrier and realized just how dangerous they were. He had no idea how long the shield would last, and their flames were just as bad as the poison. Another hunter started backing away, thinking things were getting worse and worse. At this rate, they'd all die from poison or fire. But then, an explosion cut through the fight, and someone joked that with a name like bulldogs, they expected actual dogs, not these monsters. It was Cha. He drove the enemy back with one hit. He smirked and said that for monsters known for poison and fire, they were pretty ordinary, kind of boring. One of the guild members turned and thanked him. Then his sister arrived with a guild leader, who said this was exactly what you'd expect from the martial arts guild leader. He handled those monsters in one move. He thanked the protagonist for saving their men, while the girl asked why she even had to drag him here. The boy on the ground raised his hands and apologized. He thanked the girl too, saying she helped him save his magic power. He wouldn't dare ask a leader like Cha for help, but if he had kept using magic, he might have burned through all his strength. Then he activated his magic and said that thanks to the two of them, he hadn't wasted any mana, so now he could finish the job easily. Smiling, he told them both to get ready. The others immediately waved at him. Once the monkeys were trapped, the hunters rushed in and wiped them out. Afterward, the leader walked over and asked if that had really been a lightning attack earlier. Had he learned magic too? MC said it was basically something like that, then asked what the man's magic level was. The young man scratched his head and said he was just a little short of level 40. The brunette was stunned. His level was higher than hers even though he was younger. Xiao looked at the others and said the rest seemed close to level 42. After watching them for a bit, he could tell they were pretty skilled. They replied that made sense, since they were in charge of the island's dungeons. Anything lower would be embarrassing. At that moment, the two of them were still fighting the Everness monkeys. The brunette thought back to his teleportation and asked about the magic he used. It really caught her interest. The boy said he had spent a long time training it because it was complicated and hard to use, even if it didn't seem that impressive. Then something clicked for him. He moved closer to the brunette and asked if she really understood what kind of magic it was just from watching. He couldn't help thinking the people here were awfully clingy. They'd latch onto anything. Then he looked away and realized he'd finally gotten the answer he wanted. He needed to invest in intuition and study the status window more. As the name suggested, intuition let him see things for what they really were. With his martial arts skill, that mattered more than the other stats. He pictured the stat in his mind and thought that no matter how gifted he was in martial arts, he still needed it. Seeing the true nature of things was too important, and now that he could look at this magic and understand how it worked, he was sure he could learn it too. So he smiled and said they should watch closely. He was about to show them teleportation magic. His sister was shocked, while the boy looked thrilled. Cha raised a hand and warned them not to be too surprised, but a second later, nothing happened. He was still standing in the same spot, so people asked if he hadn't used teleportation at all. The girl said they should just pretend it worked so they wouldn't embarrass him. He clearly didn't understand how the world worked, but the brunette suddenly snapped back and asked how he had activated teleportation, because nearby monkeys were sitting there at that exact moment. The guild leader came up from behind and asked what those guys were doing there. Cha just waved and said hello. The monkeys didn't even get time to react, because they were suddenly hanging high in the air, and the protagonist casually said goodbye to them. Then he cut off the teleport, and the monkeys dropped straight down. The brunette, standing below, said it was amazing. Cha told her that was how you use magic. He landed nearby and explained it simply. He sends magic at the monsters one at a time, lifts them up, then drops them. The key is using it on a target. Then he admitted there was a limit. He could only lift things about about 150 meters high, but for monsters with no wings, a fall from there was enough to kill them. Honestly, it sounded a little scary. The young man then laid out the basics. The teleport range can be adjusted through empty space and within sight, and anything in that range can be moved in any direction along with the target. He grabbed his head and wondered why MC had made him explain all of that. Did he really need it? Then everyone was shocked when MC teleported and appeared in a tree. When they asked if he had really used the teleport, he said yes. After watching it twice and hearing the explanation, he figured out how to activate it, and he thanked the boy for the help. The problem was, he got stuck in the tree and admitted it might take a while to learn how to use the spell properly. Everyone immediately went tense. Sometime later, they set out the food. The men looked up and thanked them for the help. Now they could finally rest and eat. Nearby, the guild members said they were exhausted. The girl got a little annoyed and pointed out that dangerous monkeys were still around. Yet these idiots were eating like nothing could happen. They answered that there wasn't much else they could do. The boy showed off the monsters he had killed and said he only had time to do it because those two bought him some time. When the leader brought her food and said eating mattered more since he needed energy back, the girl scoffed. She came all the way to this island, and they were feeding her plain kimbap. Then the boy turned and pointed out that the brunette was getting better with teleportation every time he tried. Smiling, he said once you fully master one skill, learning another gets much easier. If the guild leader keeps training, he might reach his level 2, maybe in 200 or 300 years. The boy quickly pulled out his notebook and said he would remember that. His sister watched from the side, thinking that even though he was her own older brother, he was acting so annoying she wanted to hit him. She lifted her mug and warned them not to follow her brother around, hoping to copy him. He learned his skills in a weird way only he can use, so they probably would not gain much from it. Still, she was surprised to hear that this guy was actually a leader. The boy raised the notebook again and said that was exactly why they should not stop now. They needed to keep improving, especially since he recently felt like he had hit his limit. Looking at the telepath list, he said he understood all that, but he still honestly wanted to learn something from the new guild leader. Then he explained that his team believed in him and counted on him because they trusted him. He knew he had to get even stronger and not let them down. He added that if he became stronger, he could protect his comrades himself. That made her remember how she had lost a friend in one of the battles. The boy scratched the back of his head and apologized for bringing up something so painful. The girl instantly snatched the roll from his hand and said she would take it after all. She figured one bite would not hurt, and the island food was surprisingly tasty too. That alone made the leader incredibly happy. He started waving his arms, shouting that he was glad she liked it and could even bring her a whole truckload. She told him that was way too much. Beside them, the brunette asked how much time they had left to catch those animals. The boy explained that the monsters were fast and there were a lot of them, so it was hard to say. Teleportation also had a usage limit. If he had known this would happen, he would have trained longer use magic more seriously. The girl grabbed him at once and demanded he repeat that. If a monster crushed him while everyone else was distracted, who would take responsibility? He asked her to calm down. Meanwhile, the main character was thinking hard. He opened his status window. His sister asked what he was doing, and he said he was trying to find a way out of this mess. Then he found one. He never thought this skill would actually matter, but he had sovereignty, a skill from a monster skill stone he got in the dungeon. Back then, he had not thought much of it and only used it because he figured he might learn monster skills. Instead, he ended up taming squirrels, and it turned out the skill worked in a totally different way, and it was pretty powerful. By now, he had learned a lot about it. The interesting part was that it could control a target's mind through the user's will. Those squirrels had basically become his puppets. They did whatever he wanted, and later he even changed the skill by combining it with control sword, which let him force targets into certain actions. As he stood there, he admitted he had only used it a few times for fun. He still did not know if it would work on monsters, since controlling their minds should be harder. So he closed his eyes and said he would test it for real. His eyes flashed brightly, and he muttered that he hoped it would work. He activated telepathic submission. A scanning wave spread out from him, sending energy in every direction. The pulse reached several kilometers away. At last, he found the monkeys. It was strange feeling the skill work from that far, but the pulse was able to take hold of them. Now he could pick a target, use mind capture, and give an order. After locking onto one monkey, he commanded all the monsters to come to him at once. Then he snapped back to himself. As he grabbed his head, everyone rushed to ask what happened and where it hurt. He turned to the leader and asked if he had enough mana left for teleportation. The answer was yes, about 5 more minutes. That was enough. The brunette looked up and said a huge crowd of monsters was coming. Then an explosion like rumble hit, along with shaking ground, and he stared at the others with wild eyes. The guild members jumped up asking what that was. An earthquake? That made no sense. They had never heard of natural disasters inside dungeons. He turned and said that if so, then it could not be an earthquake. Another guessed it had to be monsters, and realized the enemy was closing in. Suddenly, one monkey dropped nearby. It was odd. Why was there only one? The girl looked up and said the shaking was pretty strong. Someone else let out a breath, saying he thought a whole horde was coming. But then he looked up and saw something overhead. A massive group of monsters was staring down at them from the trees. The group grabbed their heads and shouted, wondering where they had all come from, and why so suddenly. The brunette immediately told the leader to get everyone out. Raising his hand, he said he would handle the rest himself. Take his comrades and leave now. The boy understood from that gesture that he was about to use that ability, and said he got it. Then the sister ran up to her brother and asked what he meant by leaving it to him. Was he seriously planning to fight them all alone? At that moment, countless monsters were watching them. The girl yelled that she was not leaving because she wanted to fight too, but the leader stepped in and said it was time to go. He reached out and activated teleport. A second later, everyone was gone. The young man lowered his gaze and said that was perfect. He took his stance and said now he could fight without holding back. His eyes lit up as the magic kicked in. A giant pillar of energy shot upward. It looked like a huge explosion. The force was so intense that everything around it shook. It could even be seen from the distant mountain, where the boy stared and said it was unbelievable. Smiling, he said the leader was amazing. His subordinates wondered if he was even human. This was too much even for a high-level adventurer. Maybe the rumors about someone above level 60 were true. The young man turned and said the guild leader was probably the one who had called the monsters together. But then he noticed the girl. She clearly was not acting like herself. So he figured that no matter how strong her brother was, he was still family. And now he had been left alone against that many monsters. Thinking she had to be worried, he gently took her by the shoulder. He moved closer and told her he understood her concern, but the guild leader was very strong, so she did not need to worry. With a bright smile, he added that since she knew her brother better than anyone, maybe she should trust his strength a little more. At first, the girl looked confused. Then her expression changed like she had just heard total nonsense. What upset her was not fear. It was that her brother was out there collecting a crazy amount of experience by himself, and she wanted to be there too. The young man froze, realizing she had not been worried at all. The brunette turned and asked why she would even worry about her brother. The girl said he was probably the one person no one ever needed to worry about. Meanwhile, her brother laughed and said the new trick was really good. All he had to do was give an order, and it worked on every monster in the dungeon. Pointing at the monkeys, he said that with his strength and sovereignty together, he could easily gather all the monsters in one place. Laughing again, he said his dungeon runs were about to get way faster, then activated sovereignty once more.
I didn't think someone would find all the fragments.
Big bad dragon, afraid now? If you don't surrender, we'll beat you to a pulp.
Yes, I'm super scared. Adventurers, please don't hit me. I hereby surrender.
That dragon could use some acting lessons, right? That's more like it. Mint, wait! Mint Senpai, you almost became a kitty wafer. Here, get up.
I didn't think any fool would have fallen for that simple trick. I'm dying over here.
You can laugh all you want. You won't be laughing soon.
Oh, that poor sap wearing the heroine's dragon armor back at ya. Speak all you want. You won't be in your right mind soon. Maybe say a proper goodbye to your friends. Like saying, sorry, I didn't mean to. I never wanted this, while you're still in your right mind. Oh, wait. You have no idea about what's going to happen, do you? Did you really think I'd be dumb enough to leave a power that strong untouched, rather than claim it for myself? Oh, I can't wait to taste your tears of despair when you lose your mind. Unable to tell friend from foe, and shred people you care about most to pieces. What are those looks on your faces? Shouldn't you be wailing and trembling in fear? Not knowing what to do?
Boring. We already know about the side effects of the armor. The one who's going to be shredded to pieces in despair is you!
Take this!
What the blink?
Knock it off! Far from you! Easy peasants!
Here comes the whirlwind!
I'll make you quiet down. All in one go.
Let's finish this! Get hurt! It's super scary inside my dreams. and pressure.
He stretched out his hand and said that settled it. Then he looked up and ordered all of them to appear right away. At once, bursts of energy started popping up around him. At that same time, the deputy head of the Jihad Guild suddenly felt something. She grabbed her head, and the secretary asked if she was okay. Maybe she was feeling unwell here too. She replied that she was fine. Then the girl turned and said she had just imagined some kind of crazy laughter. So the secretary said he would continue the report, and kept reading. He brought up the home base of the head of the Twilight Guild, and said that, as everyone knew, that person was still inactive, and the guild member's activity had dropped a lot too. He flipped the page and added that because of this, they had received a questionable dungeon assignment without much difficulty. Then he looked up and said that, for now, he thought Twilight could be ignored. The girl listened and felt something was off. Even for him, this reaction was way too much after everything that happened. When she pictured him, worry crept in. What bothered her most was whatever he was doing behind the scenes. Then a report was placed in front of her. They said this was now the top priority. The woman was shocked by what she read. It was about a dangerous dungeon found in the mountains, with a desert climate. Its risk level was 13, and the recommended level was 60 or higher. The place was mostly empty. The monsters inside were especially strange. This brutal dungeon had giant underground worms, and people had already died there. From above, the rocky area stretched out below. Someone repeated that the dungeon was risk level 13, and meant for hunters above level 60. The guy turned when he noticed movement. In the desert dungeon, the harsh sun drained everyone as monsters burst up from underground. The guy frowned. Several giant worms rose from the sand. They were nearly as tall as a 10-story building and hid deep underground. Jihai kept reading while the other person explained that even if there weren't many of them, those monsters were strong enough to kill high-level adventurers. The guild leader had checked it himself, so the report could be trusted. She closed her eyes and let out a sigh. This still wasn't enough. They'd need another raid to understand the place better. Her gaze drifted away as she thought it over. Jihei remembered Shin Hyun carrying her and wished he were here now. She looked up in confusion when the other person pulled her out of those thoughts. Going back to the papers, she was asked what was on her mind. He said she seemed off today and could rest if she wasn't feeling well, but Jihei insisted she was fine. Jihei nudged the cup. It hit the floor and shattered. Startled, the man quickly said he'd clean it up. Jihei only sighed. She felt like she was about to lose her mind. Staring at the broken cup, Jihei wondered when Shin Hyun would come back. Meanwhile, our hero watched the fight. A month had passed since the dungeon tricks began. A hoof swung close to his face. Through the smoke, a horse's head appeared. Then a bright shot slammed into his face. By mixing sovereignty with his twin swords, Shin Hyun had gotten used to telepathic control. The girl with the bow cheered after landing the hit, and Kyle praised her. Now Shin Hyun could safely summon monsters from the JG dungeon. He was basically their lord. Yunsol grabbed Kyle and asked why he was talking to her like a little kid. Watching them, her brother figured she was just fired up. He thought about their 3 different classes. Since the system gave experience to everyone who dealt damage, everything depended on hitting the enemy. Then he looked ahead and realized he might not need to step in. Several horses were chasing his teammate. A glow flared around the hero, and he decided he'd have to help after all. Shin Hyun caught his comrade. The monster chasing him looked confused when they vanished. They reappeared on a tree branch. His teammate thanked him, and Shin Hyun told him to relax while wondering if raising intelligence with stats really helped. Just putting points in didn't always mean real gains. Kyle looked at Shin Hyun with shining eyes and called him amazing. Yunsol got mad at being ignored. Shin Hyun thought about how he fully learned teleportation during these raids, though Kyle was improving with the skill even faster. Scratching his cheek, he admitted he still needed more time to master teleportation the way he wanted. The girl said she'd finally tried it herself. Later, at the restaurant, Yunsol talked about Jeju Island's special dishes, black pork and mackerel. The plate was piled with food. Holding up her glass, she said she needed to keep leveling. Yunsol had already gone up 3 levels and reached 38. Sitting beside her, Kyle said the leader would gain a ton of levels from the underground raids, and thanks to him, they had learned a lot too. Shin Hyun couldn't figure out what was wrong with those two. Setting her glass down, his sister said the island soju was really good. Shin Hyun thought his trip had been about family. He worried she trained too hard, but it seemed to be helping. Looking over the papers, Kyle said this was the schedule for the next raids. A new request had come in from the Sun Gato Guild. Shin Hyun looked down as Kyle explained that the dungeon's risk level was 11, and creatures called werebats would appear. Wolf faces with bat-like bodies. Looking back up, Shin Hyun said that if it was a bat dungeon, then it had to be some kind of. He stopped and frowned when he heard the next dungeon was a cave. Then he slammed his fist on the table. Kyle covered part of his face and said the report mentioned possible reinforcements. They were even willing to send one of their group leaders, but why? Thinking of the green portal, Shin Hyun said it all came down to the cave. It would be dark and cramped, making arrows and teleportation almost useless. After wiping her mouth, Yunsol asked if that meant they couldn't do anything. Didn't the others feel like they were being made fun of? Shin Hyun crossed his arms and said he would win. Seeing how tired his teammates were, he told them to go rest. Kyle started to protest, but the hero cut him off and said not to worry. He'd handle it himself and finish as fast as he could. Shin Hyun thought of the book and felt the bad memories come back on their own. Leaves drifted by the river as someone called out to him. Jongak smiled and held out his hand, saying he was leading today's raid. Shin Hyun shook it. Jongak said he was sure the boy already knew about the dungeon, then suggested they get started. Grass pressed under their feet as the green portal stood among the trees. Shin Hyun stopped in front of it. Clenching his teeth, he thought he hoped it wouldn't be a cave. Maybe he was wrong, but something about it made him uneasy. With several people behind him, he decided to end this quickly and head back. Ahead was a dark cave entrance. A winged creature crackled with lightning. One raid member turned to Jongkook and asked what to do, since they were moving through the dungeon much faster than expected. Shin Hyun looked over and said he was done, asking what came next. The man commented on how fast he was. Checking the radar, he said they were close to unexplored territory. The others were stunned by how quickly the hero passed them and said they needed to hurry. When someone asked if he was okay and said he looked pale, Shin Hyun lowered his head and answered that he was fine. Then he remembered himself in that cave, standing there now with his aura flaring. Shin Hyun realized those memories still haunted him, even after all this time. Jongkook put a hand on his shoulder and told him to take a break, but he flinched when the boy snapped that he'd already said he was fine. Shin Hyun turned and glared at him, asking what part he didn't understand. Jongkook quickly rummaged through a teammate's bag, apologizing and saying he was only worried. Then he asked for a recovery potion. Shin Hyun thought he needed to get out of there fast, or he might kill them. Pointing at the radar, Jongkook said the path was confusing, so they had to be patient. But they were almost done exploring, so there was nothing to worry about. Arms folded, he added that the others would guard the path now, then ordered everyone to line up and move. Shin Hyun thought they were acting way too suspicious. As he stepped forward, he wondered if maybe he was overthinking it. The group kept moving through the cave while Jongkook warned them to watch their step in the dark. He asked Shin Hyun if he'd ever visited Seokyeong Grotto, and joked that it was much better than this miserable cave. He even suggested checking out the local sites later. Shin Hyun agreed, but the look on his face still unsettled Jongkook. Frowning, Shin Hyun asked how much longer it would take. Then, something made him look up. A magic circle was carved into the ceiling. Shin Hyun's eyes widened when he realized what it was. It was a formation. At the center of the circle was a square seal shaped like a person. The whole thing burned with golden light. It didn't hurt people directly, but it could throw all their senses into chaos. Seeing the others wander around in confusion, Shin Hyun realized the formation made people walk in circles. They kept asking why the path was repeating and whether they were even going the right way. He followed the golden flow in the cave and judged from the ceiling that the energy was leading somewhere. Grabbing his own hand, He wondered what a Murim formation was doing in the normal dungeon. Was this another road to that world, or had the formation always been here? Clenching his fist, he decided that whatever the answer was, it had to be tied to Murim somehow, and he never wanted to see that world again. He shut his eyes and tried to calm himself. His grip slowly loosened as he reminded himself those days were over. Then he stomped hard and said he wouldn't be tricked, accepting the invitation. With a faint smile, he walked forward to find out who, or what, wanted to meet him. At the same time, back in the sand dungeon, a massive monster exploded out of the ground. Eyes wide, the guy yelled for everyone to get ready. He raised his sword and covered himself and the others in a bright glow, saying they were almost there. Then another monster burst from the sand. The brunette looked over the fight and said things were getting rough. He was almost out of strength. His eyes snapped open in shock. A bright red glow built up in the monster's mouth. Jinjo drew his sword and said this was his strongest move. They had to win here. His blade flashed, and he said if they lost now, they were finished. A shining wave shot straight at the monster. With his mouth wide open, he shouted for everyone to move, now. Then Jihi charged in. She locked onto the target. Her blades carved bright streaks through the air. Wiping sweat away, Jihi said it was blazing hot in here. The others were just glad it was finally over. Jinjo patted her back, praising her as a great deputy, then joked about whether she could have taken them all alone. Closing her eyes, Jihi smiled and said it wasn't a big deal, and the leader could have handled it too. Still, they only killed 3, and the team wasn't in great shape. She told her teammate to find some shade and rest for half an hour. Jinjo spread his hands and teased that Jihi was probably shy about going on a raid with him. When he joked that he and Taiyuan weren't close, so people might think this was a date, Jihi answered with an elbow to the chest and called him ridiculous. Holding his chest, Jano let out a breath and said he was glad he could at least make her laugh. Jihei told him to shut up next time, then asked why the other directors weren't here. This raid would have been much easier with them. She raised a brow when she heard they were tied up with urgent business. Elsewhere, a man watched the entrance to the sand dungeon. He pulled back his bowstring as his partner told him to do his part, and then they'd finally be accepted. 2 men stood by the portal. One said joining the guild might make martial arts easier to learn, since Xingyang was way too strict. The other asked if he'd seen the hero's strength. A man in a gray suit walked up and asked if they came here just to talk. Then the first guy grinned and said nothing ever happened at the gate, so he should join them. The second added there was still nothing to do anyway. Lifting a stack of papers, the suited man told them not to get too relaxed, even if Twilight hadn't been very active lately. Then he reminded them not to forget about that group. Bright lights suddenly appeared in the sky above them. One of them grew brighter and brighter. Purple flames wrapped around it. The man wiped blood from his face. Dropping to one knee, he wondered if this was the archer's meteor shower. But who fired it? Only the top people even knew about this raid. He spotted a figure inside the cloud. As the stranger came closer, the man froze. It was Twilight behind this. Sungmin smiled at the chief secretary and asked if he was alright. They faced each other as the man in the suit said he was glad Sungmin had arrived, then demanded to know what was happening. Sungmin answered that Twilight had started moving again. The chief secretary cursed through clenched teeth, angry that Twilight had stayed quiet until now, and suddenly pulled this. He frowned, thinking the chief and deputy still needed a few hours to break through. Should he stay here or call for backup? Then, something clicked, and his eyes went wide. He turned to Sungmin and asked how he even knew about this place. He'd heard Sungmin was never told about it. Instead of an answer, a blade stabbed into him. Blood spilled from his mouth. Holding the bloody blade, Sungmin said that if the other side was busy, he would finish things here himself. Then he pulled out his phone. Putting it to his ear, Sungmin said the cleanup was done, and the others should be arriving soon. The person on the other end smiled and said that wasn't bad. Helicopters flew overhead. He replied that they were coming too, and it was nice that everything was going smoothly. Still smiling, he told Sungmin he had done well. Later, Taehoon arrived and waved at the archer, who bowed. Looking over the bodies, Taehoon said they had done a good job. Sungmin and the archer bowed to Taehoon, and he said he liked what he saw and hoped they kept improving. Frowning, he thought Jaeho was as naive and soft as ever. He remembered walking into the room with a smile, thinking the girl never even guessed there were traitors among them. The 2 men who had just helped him smiled awkwardly. They'd been on his side since the Sun Festival. Now his foot pressed down on someone's hand. Staring at the green portal, he remembered darting it with Jaeho 7 years earlier, right after he came back from Murin and had just become a hunter. Taehoon remembered his teammates smiling and saying this was the place. He followed Jaeho as they said they'd found a brand new dungeon no one had entered before. The girl turned when he called out to her. Looking annoyed, he asked how long she planned to keep dragging them along. Because of them, she had to stop training, and he didn't want her babysitting anyone. Jaeho looked at him in silence while he asked why she even needed them. Had she already forgotten Murim? They needed to get stronger fast. Touching the necklace, he asked if she'd thought about what he said before. He told her to look at this jade. A heavenly warrior had given it to him. Taehoon held out the necklace and said it could boost martial power several times over. With a wild smile, he urged her to follow the heavenly warrior, saying they'd grow much stronger with him. But Jaeho told him to stop. He stared at her in surprise. One hand on her chest, Jaeho said she understood his fear and worry, but they weren't in Murim anymore. No one was trying to take their lives here, so why chase even more power? She smiled at their teammates and said she liked taking care of them and the younger ones. For a while, she wanted them to forget the weight of Murim. Taehoon watched, confused as Jaeho walked away toward the others. He thought she was the only one who truly understood him. They had lived through the same hell. Standing apart from the team, he realized Jaeho had left him behind because of those bugs. The thought ate at him. A bright trail followed a sword swing. Taehoon was drenched in blood. An injured Jaeho called out to him. He frowned and turned her way. Tears filled her eyes. The girl in the yellow shirt had passed out. He couldn't believe such weak monsters had hurt them this badly, and he thought about ending it himself. The archer frowned and begged for help getting the injured girl out of there. Taehoon gripped his sword hilt as someone shouted that they couldn't stay. The monsters were too strong. The archer asked if Taehoon could hear him. The blood-covered man turned back again, pleading for help and telling him to hurry. Taehoon's eyes widened. Wasn't this always how it went? He always helped Jaeho and followed her, but she still rejected him because he carried a sword and shield. She had just forgotten the despair they felt there. The necklace around his neck began to shine. The jade turned red, and a thought rose in his head. He needed to get rid of this trash. His eyes turned crazed as a voice told him to destroy everything, making Jaeho weaker and leave nothing behind. The archer lay on the ground. The rest were dead too. Then Jaeho would finally understand him. Taehoon held a blood-soaked sword. Smiling, he said he would set Jaeho free. Now completely mad, he said he'd free her from all the weakness around her. Taehoon stood by the portal. With his mouth slightly open, he stared at it in confusion. The man behind him wondered what to do now. Sunhyuk walked up and told them to guard this place. After a few steps, he looked back and ordered that if anyone tried to escape, they were to kill them. The 2 men looked uneasy, but said they understood. Sunhyuk went up to Taehoon and asked what had happened to Che Shin-hyun. He just smiled and asked if everything in Jeju was fine. Sunhyuk said there was nothing to worry about. He introduced KLN, saying he had already made his move, and no one would escape his trap. Taehoon lowered his head as Sunhyuk said they were moving faster than expected, and everything was going to plan. He started to ask where they were now, but Sunhyuk cut him off and said he trusted him. The man looked at him as Sunjun and another person appeared behind him. He said they were heading into the dungeon with him. Pulling a dagger from the void, he said he'd kill Cha Shin-hyun himself, just as promised. He only stood there, stunned. Then he let out a breath. Spreading his arms, he told the man that since he'd made that promise, he could try whatever he wanted. Sunhyuk smiled, thinking he wanted to make up for the past. Taehoon smiled too, and told them to begin. Looking at the green portal ahead, he added that the hunt should start now. Leading the others forward, Taehoon said today's hunt would begin at dawn. Meanwhile, Cha Shin-hyun looked around, wondering why nothing was happening. He stared ahead and thought he had accepted their invitation, but still nothing changed. And behind him stood Jungkook and his partner. One asked if this was really it, and the other said everything should be fine in theory, though he expected someone to be waiting for them. Hearing that, the protagonist turned around. He stepped up to them and demanded the truth about what they were planning. Jungkook acted confused. Then Cha Shin-hyun grabbed him by the face. Staring hard at him, he said he'd ignored it until now. But did Jungkook really think he'd stay quiet to the end? Jungkook frowned. A bright aura flared around MC as he warned that if Jungkook wanted to live, he'd tell him everything. The hero turned at a noise and saw a long-haired man. The hero's eyes widened. Taking off his red glasses, the man said he was faster than expected. Good, now he wouldn't have to wait. It was Galen. He smiled as his assistant said the target was in place. The hero noticed a red light near the ceiling and realized they had finally shown themselves. Getting a better look, he spotted the explosives and joked that this was one nasty welcome gift. Cha Shin-hyun just smiled and called them insane. Then the cave exploded. Ji-hae's eyes went wide. A bad feeling hit her, and she quickly looked around. She tried to brush it off, thinking she was just overheated and needed to calm down. Then she spotted two more monsters below and called it out to the others. One 400 meters east, the other 700 meters west. Maybe they could clear everything in a day, but she suddenly turned around. A pillar of fire was rising where they had set up camp, and it caught her off guard. As the flames spread across the desert, she wondered what was happening there. At the same time, Jinyo charged in. He and his ally hit the enemy together. Then Sun Yuk appeared right behind him. Each swing of his sword left glowing trails. Jinyo clenched his teeth and gripped his weapon tight. He dragged the tip across the ground, then answered with a slash that also carved a bright line. Out of strength, he slumped against his sword and cursed. Sun Yuk, Sun Jun, and the knight stood before him, and Jinyo knew handling all three at once wouldn't be easy. Someone laughed out loud. Taehyun was sitting on the sand, calmly watching the whole thing. Jinyo looked at him and decided not to even waste words on him. With a clap, the man mocked that Jinyo still looked worthy of being a leader. Smiling, Taehyun brought up the Guildmaster of Dawn and gave a fake apology for overlooking Jinyo. Jinyo bared an ugly smile through gritted teeth, saying he never imagined meeting Taehyun like this. Staring at him, Jinyo asked how he got here and what happened to the hunters guarding the entrance. The brunette glanced away, thinking back on them. Then he looked back with a wild grin and asked what Jinyo thought had happened. Jinyo's glare turned fierce. Lowering his head from exhaustion, Jinyo asked how they even found this place when the raid was supposed to be secret. But he forced himself back up, grabbed his sword, and said there had to be traitors among them. Frowning, he shouted that even so, he'd wipe every traitor out of Twilight. Sungjun raised a hand and noted that Jinyo had gotten stronger, but asked if they shouldn't hurry things up. Jinyo stared at him, confused. Then his anger flared as a spear pierced one of his comrades. The man looked at his leader with tears in his eyes. Jinyo froze in shock as the blonde begged not to die and cried for help. Nearby, Jinyoung coldly said they should put him out of his misery. Jinyo's eyes narrowed with rage. Laughing, Taehyun covered part of his face and said the sight was so moving he could almost cry. Looking up again, he added that moments like this showed just how annoying bugs could be. Ji-hae moved in from behind, saying someone had made a mistake. Her blade flashed. Sun Hyuk blocked the strike. Ji-hae smiled, glad they had finally met, while he answered by grinding his teeth. Taehyun turned toward them and asked if that was her greeting. He added that he'd missed her. Ji-hae shot him a hard glare. Then she lifted her leg and told him to stop talking nonsense. Holding her weapon ready, she reminded Taehyun they'd been enemies for a long time. He looked at her, then told Sun Hyuk he'd handle her himself. Bright flashes burst between them. Ji-hae and Sun Hyuk traded swings, their blades leaving glowing streaks. A second later, they rushed each other again. One slash cut 2 marks across Ji-hae's face. She answered by leaping above him and kicking down. Sun Hyuk threw up his arms to block, but the hit still shoved him back. Ji-hae pressed in and said he'd gotten a little stronger after following Taehyun, but there was a time when he couldn't even hold a dagger. In reply, he aimed a hand at her, but Ji-hae dodged and told him he was rushing too much. He clicked his teeth in frustration. Ji-hae gave him a puzzled smile. This fight was tougher than she thought, but she could still beat him. The real problem was what came after. Then Ji-hae noticed a group behind her. Jinyo, holding a dead comrade, screamed for the enemies to come at him. Dodging another strike, she glanced his way and figured their leader could hold on a bit longer. Sun Hyuk watched Ji-hae spring high into the air. While rising, she looked toward Taehyun and realized he was the biggest threat. Sitting with his legs crossed, he simply waved at her. She raised her blades and wondered if he planned to just sit there. What was he after? Taehyun kept smiling as he watched the battle and called out that Ji-hae had grown a lot stronger too. Then he looked away and said the operation on the island should already be finished. Back in the cave, the tunnel had collapsed. Taehyun thought of Cha, and when the rock started shifting, he decided Shin-hyun should have died by now. A bright light suddenly shone from beneath the rubble, and the next flash blasted the stones apart. Smiling, Cha Shin-hyun said this made the second time. His eyes gleamed as he asked if they were really that eager to die. Jungkook pushed himself up from the ground, held his head, said it hurt, and asked what had happened. Before anyone answered, he saw the protagonist standing in front of him. With his back still turned, MC said this wasn't funny at all. Lowering his head, Cha Shin-hyun said his rushing ahead must have forced them to show themselves early, and even then, they still tried to kill him with explosives. Jungkook let out a stunned laugh and asked if he was really okay. He was smiling, but fear showed in his eyes as he wondered who would plant explosives in a place like this. Then he felt something. A glow wrapped around him. He collapsed, clutching his throat, and Cha Shin-hyun asked if he had anything to say. Standing over him, he demanded the truth and warned him not to lie. Jungkook answered that the dungeon entrance was controlled by its owners, and this dungeon belonged to his guild. He also said placing explosives this deep would take days. Kneeling in fear, Jungkook was asked again if he truly knew nothing. The protagonist Shin-hyun's eyes turned red as he asked if he was supposed to believe that. At that, Jungkook's eyes tightened. He grabbed his chest and clenched hard. Bursting into tears, he swore he really knew nothing. If not for Cha Shin-hyun, that blast would have killed them all. Still crying, he said they had nearly died because of it. MC only stared at him in silence. Dark hands and golden chains reached toward Jungkook as he pointed out that he had stayed quiet, even though he'd had plenty of time. Those hands dripped behind the man, while Cha noted it was his first time using them on a person. Looking down at him, the protagonist activated absolute submission and said that if his mind was destroyed, he'd have only himself to blame. Dark fog rose near Jungkook's face. It almost swallowed it whole. Then the man's expression changed. A guild badge appeared, and the truth came out. Samdado had been backed by Twilight since the day it was founded. Their real job was to keep Twilight's power over the island. Jungkook remembered sitting in his office when someone asked who they were and where they were headed. Galen stood before him, calling the office shabby but cozy, then asked if this was the Samdado Guild. Lowering his hand, he asked whether anyone had contacted Jungkook. He introduced himself as Galen's death sentence. Jungkook stared in confusion, having no idea how this man was tied to Twilight, but the stranger calmly gave his name as Galen. When the man in red took off his glasses, Jungkook felt a crushing aura from him. Then Galen said he needed help, and first, he needed a car. Jungkook's men could only watch in confusion as he went on, kneeling, explaining that Twilight had ordered them to obey every request Galen made without question. Cha Shin-hyun listened in silence as Jungkook said their mission was to get Galen to the dungeon at the exact time and handle the rest themselves. As Jungkook's comrades tried to wake him, MC watched and realized no shockwave should have reached through the dungeon. That meant the explosives had to be planted somewhere else. Shin-hyun closed his eyes and pictured the cave entrance, focusing hard and wondering why they had already run. Then he said he couldn't wait to meet them. The long-haired man looked confused when Chow told him to move. A bright sphere formed in the protagonist Shin-hyun's hand as he said the man was in the way. The boy frowned and answered that he'd protect the leader to the end. MC fired a beam of light from his hand. It tore into the pile of rocks, hit deep, and exploded. A new path opened up. As Chow headed into it, one of Jungkook's men asked what kind of skill that was, but another snapped that it didn't matter. While trying to wake their leader, they were relieved they might survive and go home, but he told them they were staying here. The two froze in shock. Turning back with a smile, the protagonist Shin-hyun said they had to pay for their sins. Did they really think they'd be forgiven? Waves spread from him through the cave. The boys kept trying to wake Jungkook, crying that otherwise they'd all die. With tears in their eyes, they watched rocks fall from the ceiling and begged for mercy, saying they had done nothing wrong. Hands behind his head, Chow listened to them beg to be saved and said he'd lived in a cave for 10 years. Now they could try it too. Then he smiled and said that was reason enough, thanking them for giving him the chance to crush them. But first, he needed to say hello to Galen. Wiping away blood, Ji-hae said she hadn't expected this. Seeing Sung Hyuk split into several copies with his assassin skill, Ji-hae smirked and admitted his training had paid off. Sung Hyuk and the clone smiled back. He said she was still looking down on him, and first they should clean up the blood. Then he told her it was time to use shadow play. Ji-hae just smiled and asked what he meant. Lowering her hands, she asked again if he really wanted her to use it now. Sung Hyuk watched her as she said that skill was too precious to waste on someone like him. She added that even without it, he still couldn't beat her. Sung Hyuk clenched his teeth. All three copies charged at once. As her hands multiplied with the Dark King's poisonous kiss, Ji-hae told him to watch how a real killer fights. With a hard look, she said she'd show him the moonlight of the bloody path. The fight continued under the blazing sun. Then someone shot between them in a flash. Sung Hyuk and his copies chased after Ji-hae, Ji-hye. She sprang off the ground. In midair, Ji-hye flipped over. Sung-hyuk tracked her closely. His clones started glowing. A blast went off a second later. Ji-hye barely dodged the fireball. 3 clones rushed her again. Swinging her blade, Ji-hye mocked him for being such a Taehoon fanatic. A bright slash swept towards Sung-hyuk and his copies, as she added that he was just as stubborn as his friend. Suddenly, a bright beam flashed overhead. Ji-hye tore through the clones with lightning-fast strikes, then turned and noticed something off. Sung-hyuk was right behind her. Light burst from his touch as he used an origin skill. He drove a poisonous spear into Ji-hye. Dark stains spread across her blade, and she couldn't tell what they were at first. Ji-hye jumped back. Looking at her weapon, she realized the poison was eating through the dagger. She landed and reset her stance. Glancing up, she found more clones in front of her, and knew one mistake would kill her. Still, she was enjoying it. She tossed the ruined daggers aside and asked when his style had changed this much. Smiling, Ji-hye said she'd need a different weapon. Sung-hyuk stayed quiet, then thanked her. Ji-hye lifted an eyebrow. With his head lowered, Sung-hyuk said she was the one who once taught him how to get stronger, pulling out new weapons from her portals. Ji-hye said she didn't remember that. Thinking about the poison, she knew she had to be more careful and not hesitate, but she still had to find his real body. Standing among the copies, Sung-hyuk said she really couldn't remember. He frowned and said he'd remind her. Ji-hye raised her blades as he warned this was her last chance to use shadow play. She only asked if he was tired of bringing it up, because she wasn't going to use it. She smiled and said that skill wasn't for him. In her mind, she knew she had to save her strength for Taehoon. Through gritted teeth, Sung-hyuk asked if she was sure. He appeared behind her, and she looked back in surprise. Sung-hyuk slashed at her. At that moment, he remembered her smile and the way she mocked him for copying her dual dagger style. Then another memory hit him. Ji-hye asking if he was really the one Taehoon wanted to replace her with. He looked away when she brought up Taehoon. Standing over him, Ji-hye called Taehoon a bastard. Sung-hyuk raised a hand without thinking as she told him that. Pathetic as he was, his very existence annoyed her. Ji-hye knelt down and pressed a knife to his throat as she talked about what it takes to become a killer, to become stronger. Smiling at him, she said real strength starts when you truly try to kill someone. If he wanted power, then he had to hate someone enough to want them dead, just like she did. Then she tensed at a voice and realized Taehoon had already found her. Rising to her feet, Ji-hye said Sung-hyuk had understood her. The person she wanted to kill most had come here, so his death would wait. Standing tall, she delivered one last blow. He had no talent at all, and he should quit this life and start over. Sung-hyuk could only stare at her. His face tightened when she said he simply wasn't built for this. Now he said that in that moment, she had crushed his pride and almost erased his whole sense of self. After that humiliation, he rebuilt himself from scratch and completely changed how he fought. Blood at her lips. Ji-hye heard him say he had done all of it for one reason, to kill her. Watching her wounded state, Sung-hyuk said that even as an enemy guild member, she was someone he respected. That was why being disgraced by her hurt even more. Catching the dagger in his hand, he admitted she had been right. He raised the blade and said his wish to kill her had made him far stronger. But Ji-hye suddenly said she remembered something. In an instant, everything around him turned pink. Sung-hyuk looked around, confused, as Ji-hye said he wanted to surpass her that badly. With a cold smile, she asked if he'd learned anything yet. Folding her arms, Ji-hye said he missed the most important part of what she told him, and asked if it really felt that dark in here. Sung-hyuk turned, saw her behind him, and realized those had been shadow clones. He ground his teeth, understanding it had all happened in that instant. While Ji-hye said she'd give him one more lesson. Holding out her hand, she told him a true killer only reveals themselves after the target is already dead. Shadows wrapped around his face. He screamed Ji-hye's name. She looked at him and said he got carried away by his own victory. Then she dropped her hand and tore him apart, saying it had all been an illusion. Glancing back to where he really was, she called him an idiot. Then she noticed something. A voice said Sung-hyuk had gotten pretty strong. Ji-hye smiled. He had finally shown up. Taehoon returned the smile, as she made it clear he was the one she wanted dead. Walking closer, he asked if she enjoyed the little show he put on. Ji-hye raised her weapon and said she had plans for him. He shouldn't expect an easy death. She meant to drag it out and make it bloody. Taehoon grinned wider. Reaching into a portal, he said that was exactly what he wanted. A sword appeared in his hand, and he said those were the words he had been waiting to hear from Ji-hye. Their auras flared around them. Frowning, Ji-hye finally used shadow play. Taehoon kept smiling as the two clashed. Ji-hye's call showed on the phone screen, but the message said the subscriber was temporarily unavailable. With 2 people watching him, Shin-yeon thought she might just be busy, but he urgently needed to tell her about Sindado. He glanced aside when someone asked if he was trying to reach Ji-hye. A man appeared behind him and said she probably wouldn't answer. 2 more stepped up and added that her dungeon was likely under attack right now. Shin-yeon looked at the man in front of him, who calmly said he knew phone signals couldn't reach that place. It was Gao Lin, smiling. He said Shin-yeon was probably wondering how he knew that, but for people from Murim it was nothing unusual. Reflected in Gao Lin's glasses, Shin-yeon asked if that was supposed to satisfy his curiosity. A portal opened in front of Shin-yeon. He said Gao Lin still didn't look like much of an expert, and he had more questions. Was he really from Murim? More importantly, how did he know about the dungeon attack? Gao Lin waved a hand and said he could explain, but Shin-yeon's attitude was rude. Removing his glasses, he asked if he'd like to ask more politely. Shin-yeon closed his eyes and said fine. If he didn't want to talk, then so be it. Then he fixed Gao Lin with a sharp stare and said he'd beat the answers out of him if he had to. The scythe wielder looked thrilled and called Shin-yeon impressive. As blue magic swirled around the hero, he thought the rumors were true. Shin-yeon really could control magic at a crazy level, enough to raise goosebumps, and he could probably mix it with martial arts too. Then Gao Lin brought his hands together and formed a magic circle. Another circle spread beneath their feet. Shin-yeon looked down and wondered if it was a trap. Smiling, Gao Lin said it was something like that. But as it activated, Shin-yeon felt this was nothing like the ones he'd seen before. Gao Lin called it his greatest creation, a Murim gravity trap fused with magic. Clenching his fist, Shin-yeon activated the heavenly golden seal. The others rushed him at once. Turning to face them, he smiled and called it a cheap trick, but then his eyes went wide. Gritting his teeth, Shin-yeon couldn't understand what was happening. At the same time, a red-haired fighter came straight at him. As he pulled back his fist, Shin-yeon realized his whole body had become much heavier. He struck at the attacker, but the man only smiled, and Shin-yeon was stunned to find he couldn't use his internal energy. He stared in shock. The other 2 moved in to hit him too. Shin-yeon threw up a barrier and slipped behind it. Frowning, he cursed under his breath. Go Walin's 3 helpers stood behind him. Watching them smile, Shin-yeon wondered if all of them were from Murim. Enjoying himself, Gao Walin said he liked seeing that desperate look on the hero's face, and asked how it felt to fight without internal energy. Shin-yeon raised his arms against the attacks, as Gao Walin explained that the heavenly golden seal was absorbing all his energy. Then he looked up and heard the rest, that stolen energy was being passed on to Gao Walin's subordinates. Spreading his arms, he said that no matter how strong Shin-yeon was, he couldn't beat them. With a smug smile, he added that the stronger Shin-yeon got, the stronger they got too, so winning was impossible. The 3 assistants charged with shining eyes, sure the power they stored up would kill him. Shin-yeon just smiled and told him to stop talking. He stomped the ground and said he was sick of hearing him. Light burst around Shin-yeon as he said he wasn't called the Immortal Sword Emperor for nothing. He'd show Gao Lin how small he looked before real power, real law. A red circle on the tree trunk showed a formation made by placing natural objects or charms in the right pattern. A blue circle sat on the stone, tied to space. Liang, dressed in red, was a legendary strategist and formation master. With his octagonal method, he could call wind and lightning and wipe out an army. Gao Lin sat in the lotus position, doing a ritual. He admired Liang and kept sharpening that art even after returning from Murim. The guy with the scythe sat with his eyes shut. Then he opened them wide, thinking he was worthy of being called a god too. A sword blade shot forward. The red-haired boy swung it, but Shin-yeon suddenly slipped behind him and said he understood it now. The others turned in confusion as he explained that golden meant energy, a wordplay behind the heavenly golden seal. Right then, Acorn and his partner lunged at him. Bright flashes burst in front of them, and they couldn't understand what was happening to their bodies. Shin-yeon moved to the other side with a grin and said he was almost done, so they could wait a little longer. Gao Lin stared in shock, thinking Shin-yeon had made a new law. He'd never heard of anything like it, so how had he found the formation's weak point? Wrapped in blue aura, Shin-yeon looked impossible to him, and he couldn't figure out when the formation had been changed. The red-haired boy looked confused when Shin-yeon Shinhan asked if they were magic. Shinhan rubbed the back of his head and said he didn't know much about them either, but their energy felt very similar. Hamster and the others looked stunned when he said that even though they used martial arts, they definitely hadn't returned from Murin. He recalled their attack and said their skills were rough and mediocre, far too crude for someone from Murin. Their martial flow didn't match true art, and that proved it. Gao Wulin gave a wicked smile and said Shinhan was exactly right. Then he spread his hands and said he was right to call them human. The three frowned when he revealed they were artificial humans. Crossing his arms, Shinhan said that teaching martial arts by forcing energy into someone else's body was possible, but at this level it made no sense. He looked at Gao Wulin and asked what he had done differently. Seeing the three beside Gao Wulin, Shinhan said there had to be another method. Lowering his head a little, he added that if they'd been made normally, he wouldn't sense a difference. Was this demon cult magic, or the magic of earthly mages? Gao Wulin smiled and said Shinhan got it. He pictured bones floating in blood and said these useless people had been remade into useful ones. A few worthless lives were the price. After thousands of test subjects, he created subordinates equal to high-level adventurers, and now he'd take everything from Shinhan with his formation. Scratching his ear, Shinhan said so Gao Wulin had been using people as sacrifices. Then he smiled. A bright flash appeared over Gao Wulin's head, and Shinhan said he liked his tricks. Gao Wulin covered his eyes, not knowing what was going on, while Shinhan decided it was time to end this. Blue fire glowed in Shinhan's hands as he said that when he fought demon followers, even tearing them apart never made him feel pity. If anything, it cleared his head. With a dark smile, he said it was time to hunt a demon. Gao Wulin lowered his head and called him a bastard. He pressed his hands together, formed a magic circle, and demanded to know how Shinhan dared say that. The red-haired boy looked at his hands and smiled. Acorn and his partner were glad they could move again, and felt full of energy. But Shinhan raised his leg and told them they were already in his trap. Then he slammed his foot into the ground. Blue spread through the formation and replaced the gold. Gao Wulin looked around, confused about what he was seeing. Blue flames covered the three assistants, and they cried for help. Their faces twisted with pain and despair as they begged someone to do something. Shinhan walked past with his hands in his pockets. Stopping by Gao Wulin, he said fiery gold was still fire, and fire melts metal. Smiling, he explained that understanding the 5 elements was basic. He removed the metal essence and replaced the gold by tuning the formation. Gao Wulin stared in shock and asked how he did it. Shinhan looked amused and said he'd studied formations a little in Murin, so Gao Wulin's skill meant nothing to him. Gao Wulin frowned as Shinhan said he was only having a little fun. He dropped to his knees, saying he'd spent his whole life on research and experiments. Staring at the ground, he said Shinhan had crushed all his pride, and asked how he had reached that level. Shinhan folded his arms and said he shouldn't be upset. Once he knew Shinhan's level, it would feel like an honor. With a broad grin, he added that this kind of field needed talent. Without it, hard work alone would never be enough. Still kneeling, Gao Wulin bowed his head as Shinhan prepared to kill him. His own formation had drained all his energy. Gao Wulin couldn't even move. Shinhan crouched beside him and said that since he'd stolen so much energy from others, he shouldn't mind losing his own. Holding out his hand, Shinhan used absolute order and told him to reveal everything about Jihai. Gao Wulin's eyes began to glow. He pictured the girl covered in blood and said she was dead. Jihai lay in her own blood. She had always been alone, in the original world and in Murin. Then, when they met, Taehun reached out to her with a smile. He said he hadn't known other returnees existed, and introduced himself, happy to meet her. Later, he held back a monster and told Jihai to run, promising he'd be fine. At one point, he covered his ears and said the cave still reminded him of Murin. Taking Jihai's hand, he begged her not to leave him. It was hard for her to trust him, but she was also grateful. Someone needed her for the first time. Now Jihai finally opened her eyes. Looking ahead, she thought they never should have met. From below, Taehun told her to get up. Smiling, he asked if she was really satisfied dying like this. She forced herself back to her feet. Her eyes shone brightly. Jihai rushed him again. Taehun raised a shield in front of himself. Her fist struck the spherite. An explosion followed. She covered her face with one hand. After shaking her head, she saw Taehun flip away. Jihai gritted her teeth, thinking she had to be getting tired. Standing before her, Taehun said she'd even used shadow play and told her to give up. Jihai frowned, wondering when he had become this strong. Seeing the red aura around Taehun, she realized he hadn't wasted his time either. Jihai swallowed hard. There was one last thing she wanted to know. Taehun smiled and asked what it was. He stood there with his mouth slightly open. 2 other men lay beside him, and Jihai asked why they had to die. He turned away.
If you want her to be quiet, just shut her up for good. Isn't it painful to hide your true nature? Come on, let it all out. Haven't you always wanted to do that? Still running away? Think you can? different. So this is the only end.
Clawzilla! Are you going to give up like that? Taya! You're not alone! Trust us! Are you okay? You, Clawzilla, really worried me there.
I'm sorry for making you worried. Even if I can't defeat you, I can still try to accept you. Accept you as part of myself, along with my companions.
Super scary inside my dreams. Take this! If you can. Come on, turn it! Don't stop! Yeah? Far away! Can you keep up with the wind?
Hey, annoyed she was asking that again, and said he was bored of it. She should ask something more interesting. Her hand shook with anger. Upset that he still refused to answer, she asked why the words she should be saying were coming from him. Facing him, Jihai said he always dodged this question, but this time she would hear the answer. Taehoon lowered his head in silence. Then he opened his mouth and said they were weak. A mad smile returned as he asked if it wasn't human nature to want to step on others. A whirlwind rose around Jihai. She said she'd been foolish to think talking to him would give her answers. A tear slid down her cheek as she said she was done, and would finish this now. A moment later, she charged, sure she would kill him. As she closed in, she thrust her blade forward. Taehoon blocked it with his sword. Right then, a bright flash appeared. Then came an explosion. Clouds drifted across the blue sky. Shinhyun sat on a rock. He looked down at his phone. Gao Wuxian knelt there with his mouth open, as Shinhyun said their guild served the heavenly warrior. It looked like this place was full of scum like Taehoon. Gao Wuxian's body dropped to the ground. Shinhyun wanted more answers, but he was already dead. Looking down, Shinhyun said he had learned the location, but it was still 450 kilometers away in a straight line. The sea stretched below. He pictured Kaiyal with a magic circle over her head. Looking down, he realized there was only one way. Standing at the cliff's edge, he said that at his current level, he could get there in 20 minutes. The question was whether he should worry about that. He turned to leave, telling himself he and Jihai were only business partners. If she was in trouble, he didn't have to save her. As he kept walking, he thought about Murim, where killing and dying was normal, so why should he help her? He had no real reason. Then he suddenly stopped, remembering what she said. Shinhyun pictured Jihai smiling, and asking him out on a date. That memory made his eyes go wide. He remembered her holding that mug, and saying he knew about the Kinshin silver needle. She used to come there often just to drink that tea. His hand tightened on his collar, as he remembered her demanding the truth. Angry, she grabbed him and said Yunsol wasn't the same little kid he remembered. Then he recalled her reaching out and saying she was now the official deputy head. Back then, he had greeted her, and she thanked him. Now he covered his mouth in shock. Then he lowered his hand and started to laugh. The sound echoed through the whole area. He grabbed his head, thinking he really had gone crazy. As he stretched out his hand, he thought about how few things truly mattered to him. Then he clasped his hands behind his back, and decided the only ones on that list were himself and Yunsol. Shinhyun broke into a wide grin. As he turned back, he realized someone else had joined that list without him even noticing. A second later, he took off. Shinhyun raced through the forest at full speed. With a smile, he told Jihei to hold on a little longer. The mountain stretched out far below. Singmin happily leaned back with his hands behind his head, sitting on a folding chair and saying this felt great. His partner agreed it wasn't even that hard. Taking a drink, Junghen said joining Twilight had been the right move. His pay was now 3 times better. Still, his partner looked off into the distance and wondered what that crazy guy had been thinking. They were talking about Shinhyun. Junghen checked, and Singmin said they were lucky Mr. X knew a monster like that would join Dawn. Junghen tossed his can and guessed Shinhyun was probably dead by now. The archer smiled and added that even if he escaped, there was no way he could get here from Jeju Island. Then both men froze in shock as birds burst out of the forest. Singmin nervously stared that way and asked what it was. His partner had no clue. Jungyun looked at the trees and muttered that this place should be quiet. So what could cause that? Frowning, he said something felt seriously wrong. Then he saw it. Shinhyun was staring at him with burning eyes. A moment later, Shinhyun reached out his hand. Both men's eyes eyes went wide. They knew exactly who it was. Then all that followed were flashes and screams. His blade ripped through the air. Smiling, Taehyun asked Ji-hae what she thought she was doing. Her strikes left bright trails as he mocked her. If she wanted to kill him, then show her real strength. Ji-hae looked at him as he asked where all her spirit had gone. She clenched her teeth while he kept taunting her, asking if this was some kind of joke. Then Taehyun moved his sword behind his back. Ji-hae's dagger started to break apart. She stared at it in shock. Then Taehyun reached toward her. He grabbed her by the face. His eyes glowed as he warned her not to lose focus in a fight. Then he hurled her into a rock. Walking up to her, he said he was getting bored. He stopped beside her and asked if she really thought she could win with power like this. Ji-hae looked up as he mocked her, saying this was all she had. Leaning down, he asked if she understood now which of them was right. Then he grabbed her by the throat, grinning like a madman. He said following the heavenly warrior had paid off. It still wasn't too late, so he offered her one more chance. Ji-hae stared at him in shock as he claimed they'd become so strong no one would ever dare threaten them again. But Taehyun suddenly looked surprised when she thanked him for the offer. With a hard stare, she said she'd rather die than follow him, and told him to stay out of her life. He shook with anger. Ji-hae repeated his own idea back at him, that the stronger one is always right, and said he was still just a child. Smiling, she told him he'd die like a dog for following the heavenly warrior. Taehyun frowned. Ji-hae pictured Shinhyun's face. In her mind, he was chained up, facing the screen gods, saying he was hunting the heavenly warrior. She remembered Shinhyun dragging Singmin across the ground. His mind was full of revenge against the one who ruined his life. So would he really let the heavenly warrior's servant live? Taehyun smiled and repeated Shinhyun's name. Ji-hae looked at him as he said Shinhyun should already be dead. Then her eyes widened. Behind Taehyun, she saw a figure. Taehyun kept bragging that killing Shinhyun would help the Tenjo Guild rise, because they were strong and served the heavenly warrior too. Shinhyun let out a sigh as he listened. Taehyun said the Miriam returnees and their group had gone to Jeju Island, and each one was stronger than top adventurers. Taehyun spread his arms and said that no matter how long Shinhyun had trained in Miriam, he still couldn't beat the guild, but his smile froze when a voice behind him said hello, and told him to keep going. Smiling, Shinhyun asked if Taehyun was talking about burying him. Taehyun stared in shock and said Shinhyun was supposed to be dead. With Yoonhyun over one shoulder, and Singmin in his hand, Shinhyun answered that he was very much alive, and he brought these guys back too. Shaking them a little, he said they were in his way, so he killed them. Then Ji-hae called his name. Shinhyun looked up and saw she was still alive. Ji-hae was smiling behind Taehyun. Shinhyun noticed the many wounds covering her body. He stared ahead without saying a word. Blue energy started to spread around him. Taehyun stared back, thinking Gaolin had lost to him. But how had Shinhyun gotten out? He was supposed to be on Jeju Island. Taehyun gritted his teeth. As Taehyun hid behind his shield, Shinhyun said it had been a while. They hadn't met since the Sun Festival. A bright sphere formed on the shield when Taehyun used Reflect. Shinhyun slammed into it and demanded an answer. Blue power burst out. Taehyun's mouth fell open. With a grin, Shinhyun asked if he believed in any religion. Pointing his fist at him, he said Taehyun should pick one, because as far as Shinhyun was concerned, Taehyun wasn't living through today. Taehyun swung his hand and shot back that Shinhyun wouldn't survive today either. The green-eyed man shouted Shinhyun's name in rage. Then he slashed with his sword. An explosion burst between them. The blast spread outward as the fight kept going. Shinhyun shifted his hand aside just as the brown-haired man moved in to strike. Then Taehyun sent a whip flying at him. Shinhyun rose in a burst of magic and said that when he first entered Miriam, he nearly died. Holding a magic sphere in both hands, he added that, out of courtesy, he'd use martial arts too. The focus fell on the sphere as he spoke of the 100 dragons descending. Taehyun frowned and yelled, asking what that was. Shinhyun raised the orb over his head and smiled darkly. Then he unleashed it. The soaring sky dragons rushed forward in a blue wave. Taehyun looked at them, then smirked and thought it was just ordinary martial arts, using body energy like he did. Still smiling, he Diwid, held out his hand and mocked Shinhyun, asking where he stole a technique like that. He said it was a waste in Shinhyun's hands. Then he raised both hands and shouted that if that was all, he wouldn't even need to dodge. Power tore across the ground. Then everything exploded. Ji-hae covered one eye, let out a breath, and tried to understand what just happened. Looking ahead, she realized neither Shinhyun nor Taehyun was anywhere in sight. The attack had blown them both away. Then a voice behind her asked if the deputy leader was all right, and she flinched in fear. It was Jin-ho, kneeling in front of her and saying he was glad she was safe. Jaha rushed to him, asking how he got there and what happened to the others. He answered that their comrades were dead. As flashes of the battle came back to him, he said he was the only one who made it out alive. Nearby, someone coughed up blood. The green-eyed man gripped his sword and thought he had barely survived. That attack was far stronger than he expected. Then the brown-haired man turned as people ran up, shouting to ask if he was okay. The red-haired man looked around in shock and asked what happened here, why so much land had been destroyed.
We did it. We did it, Taya! Thanks to you. Sorry for making you worry about me.
Hey, it's about time you stop apologizing.
That's right. You sound like a total stranger. For now, you just need to celebrate. We might have to celebrate somewhere else. What is this shabby lair of a dragon? It's so flimsy. Let's go, go, go. Back to the village with the good news. How did it just end like that? There's still so many things to do. I wanted to hold a victory banquet and explore the fuzzy continent more.
It's called the Warren Continent.
Yes, the Warren continent. Oh, Taya, you want to keep playing too, right? How about we play another round?
It's time for dinner already. You still have work tomorrow, right?
Right. Well, then let's play again the next time. It's a promise.
Are you hungry? I got a candy.
I'll pick it up. Taya, your hair in this picture is a lot shorter. Did you take it a few years ago?
That picture was taken a few years ago, all right. I never told you? Once my powers awoke, I started working in the bureau with Master. I returned to the Hethro HQ and joined Unit 2 only recently.
What did you just say? Mint, your kettle is whistling. Wait, you're not a rookie. All this time, I thought I wanted to set an example before newbies as a good senpai.
Mint, didn't you do a pretty good job?
Well, Mint, who's a great senpai?
Senpai, I'll cheer for you. I suddenly realized my kettle is boiling. I'll be right back. Such a dumb cat.
Here, candy?
I'm back with food I cooked. Eat as much as you want. Try some? Wanna try some? What about you, Coco? You must be hungry.
A food-like substance before you looks normal enough. Still, knowing Mint, you can't help but stay on high alert. If I remember correctly, Mint's cooking skills... Mint is staring at you. Mint is staring at you in full anticipation. No, you failed to come up with an excuse to deny Mint's request. Mint, I trust that your cooking skills have improved. Then I'll take a bite.
Coco? Alas, the player failed the constitution check. Today, Lacrimosa had a good
What should we do today?
Someone answered that Jihei caused it. Standing among the rubble, another voice said things looked even worse than expected. The speaker sounded familiar. Shin-hyun looked up in surprise and asked if Sing-jin and Ji-young were here too. The red-haired man glared at him and demanded to know how he got there, stunned that this monster still didn't look tired. Frowning, the green-eyed man thought things were bad. He still hadn't recovered. As the other stared at him, he kept thinking that he just needed a little more time. Then a sly smile crossed his face. Turning to his allies, he ordered them to kill Shin-hyun. Watching them, the brown-haired man guessed Shin-hyun had weakened from that skill. This was the perfect chance, and he said out loud that 2 more bodies would do. The other 2 looked ahead in fear when their leader asked if they were deaf. If they wanted to live, they had to attack. Even though they hesitated, they agreed. Then they gathered their strength. One of them swore he'd get revenge for the Sun Festival. As they charged, the red-haired man yelled to get ready, and a fire dragon scream rang out. The brown-haired man raised his sword, thinking he only needed a little more time to recover. The other guy was terrified. Then the 2 of them rushed in. Right then, Jinho asked if Chao's leader was here too. Wasn't he supposed to be on Jeju Island? Jiho cut him off and said they could talk later, because the blast came from nearby. She stared forward in shock. Lying there, the man felt a little relieved. A dark figure stood in the middle of the explosions, and the voice finished the thought. He'd been trapped in a cave. Then, the man smiled and said he rushed here by teleporting across the sea and the mountains. Crossing his arms, he looked at his enemy and said he knew he was trying to recover. Everyone was stunned. They could hardly believe it happened in such a short time. They kept staring at him, thinking it was like no time had passed at all, when he grinned and said the snack wasn't bad. Then he stepped forward and said now it was time for dessert. His opponent got mad, unable to understand why he still hadn't recovered. He let go of the sword, still unsure, but after pushing through his doubts, he should have healed by now. Staring at the main character, he wondered if he could really beat this monster. Then a voice in his head told him not to worry. It was time to wake up. He'd suffered enough. The pendant on his chest began to glow. Lost and shaken, he asked if this would make him stronger. The voice told him he was the only one who could do that, then urged him to give everything he had and fight to survive. His eyes turned blood red. A sudden magical change took over his body. Ti-hun's eyes went wide. He said it was incredible. His whole body was overflowing with power. He froze for a second, then said this strength would let him surpass himself. After that, he threw his head back and screamed. The protagonist watched him and said his enemy still had a few tricks left. The man smirked and asked if he was still trying to hang on to life, then promised he would die today. He smiled as the voice in his head said Ti-hun was a loyal tool, and they were almost there. A black-haired man stood smiling among chains, while the voice said it had missed Shin Hong. Another transformation began. A black mask formed over the man's face. The protagonist laughed and said, "Not bad. You really hid that from me." He kept watching him, and said that, judging by his real power, it was coming from the necklace hanging on the masked man's chest. Then he lunged forward. The brunette answered that he was pretty fast. He reached for his sword and said he was actually getting excited. Since that power wasn't truly his, he'd use a weapon. Lifting his hand, he said it was an honor. This swordsman was finally drawing his blade. His opponent swung and grinned. It was an origin skill. Smiling, he held the sword in front of him, and said the blade suited him perfectly, so his enemy should get ready. The opponent frowned and attacked. He watched the flying sword without the slightest fear. Then he smiled and said he hoped it could keep up. As soon as he said that, he counterattacked, catching the enemy off guard. Looking at the blade's tip, he thought it was a shame. Someone clearly didn't value their sword. The blue-haired man turned and said, "Losing your weapon in battle means certain death." The necklace flashed green. The protagonist noted that this little toy was running out of power too. Then he held out his hand and asked if that was all he had. A blue beam shot between them. Ti-Hun coughed up blood as the protagonist said he had plenty of questions, but first, he grabbed him by the throat and demanded to know who was hiding behind the name Heavenly Warrior. Looking down at him, the protagonist said that was the only reason he was still alive. Otherwise, he would have died the moment he touched Yoon's soul. Then, with eyes burning with total control, he ordered him to talk. Tightening his grip, he pressed harder. "Who is the Heavenly Warrior? Who does he serve? Who is he?" Blood ran from Ti-Hun's mouth as he quietly said the Heavenly Warrior was the one who sent them to Murim. The protagonist froze and asked again. A notification with a question mark popped up. Ti-Hun stared in surprise. The protagonist started to ask what the hell. Then chains burst out from the notifications. They rushed toward them, and the brunette realized this was the one living inside his body. Chains wrapped around the protagonist, and he demanded the answer again. The man let out a sigh before realizing he was chained to a wall. He struggled to get free, not understanding what was happening. Shin Yoon shouted, asking what the hell had happened. Then he looked down and realized this was the cave from Murim. In shock, he yelled that it was a lie. He couldn't believe he was back there again. He turned when someone asked if he recognized the place. There he saw Ti-Hun sitting on a rock. He said this was his world, created by the Soul Sword, and asked if the memories were coming back. Smiling, he added that he was the first to arrive there, and it was nice to meet him. Then he said this was their first real face-to-face meeting. The protagonist kept straining against the chains and asked if he planned to keep him there. Ti-Hun answered that the whole space was made from the sword's soul, so those chains wouldn't break easily. He looked annoyed when Ti-Hun asked if he wanted to calm down. Then he asked if he wasn't really Ti-Hun. Studying him, he said that based on his swordsmanship, he had to be the Heavenly Warrior. Ti-Hun pulled a hand toward himself and said there was a lot to ask about that. Then he held out his hand and said this was a rare chance. Ask anything, and he'd answer honestly. The protagonist said nothing. Ti-Hun's eyes widened when he heard the question. Did you have fun? Shin-Hyun, confused, asked if he had watched it all. The end of it all. He was thrown into a horrible world, always alone, with death around every corner, never knowing if his family was alive, and lived that way for 140 years. The protagonist shut his eyes and asked if he had seen all of that. The man stood there with a sword in his hands. Fear filled the protagonist's eyes. Then he shouted in rage. After all 140 years of pain, was that fun to him? Ti-Hun stood quiet for a moment, then honestly said he was a little bored. Shin-Hyun stared at him in horror and asked again. The man stepped closer and said he was tired. He kept walking toward the protagonist, saying he had nearly died. Coming right up to him, he said he'd waited patiently just to watch his level rise. And even then, before he could finish, he was cut off by one question. Why? Ti-Hun looked straight at him and asked why he was still human. He had suffered in that world and gone through endless pain, yet somehow stayed the same. Shin-Hyun asked what he was talking about. Then Ti-Hun burst out laughing. The blue-haired man looked at him, confused. The protagonist fixed his eyes on him and said there was something he really wanted to know. He pulled at the chains and said he didn't even want to think about what Ti-Hun had said, but if he was that bored, good. Grabbing the chain, he said he had one regret he wanted to settle, just one. Then he shouted that this bastard had ruined his life and added, Heavenly Warrior. He raised his hand to strike, shouting that he would kill him. The protagonist slammed his fist into Ti-Hun's solar plexus. Blood burst from Ti-Hun's mouth. The stones on the bracelet shattered. The battered man dropped to his knees. Shin-Hyun gritted his teeth and thought about those words. Blood ran down his hand as the warning echoed. Open the door to ascension and go past human limits, or lose everything. He breathed hard while staring at the bloodied man. Then a man and a girl came up from behind. Jiha's eyes were wide, still shaken from being strangled. Shin-Hyun turned and asked what had happened to Ti-Hun. Clenching his teeth, he cursed under his breath. The next day, he answered a call in the office. Chul-Ho said he'd follow the advice he was given. After hanging up, he set the phone down. Once Dusk learned from Dawn that Ti-Hun was dead, they fully surrendered. He stood in the middle of the office. One man lay on the floor, and most of Dusk's high-rank hunters were already dead. Clutching a dagger, the survivors lost their nerve, which sped up Dusk's merger into Dawn. A man screamed hysterically, throwing papers everywhere. He yelled that the guild would fall apart without him. It was Dawn's chief secretary, Dong H1. He had played dead during the attack, then healed himself afterward. His hands were covered in blood, but the problem of joining the two big guilds was finally solved. Someone suddenly shouted, asking where his tie was. The man yelled that Dawn's speech was today, and asked why it was taking so long to fix his tie. Just then, someone rushed in and warned that the press conference started in 10 minutes. Jae-Hyung and Shin-Hyun sat across from each other in silence. He thought this felt weirdly familiar. Glancing at his cup, he noticed it was Kinch and Silver Needle again. When asked if he liked it, he said tea like this was for enjoying, then asked what she planned to do. Jae-Hyung picked up her cup and started explaining. Smiling, she said the public story was simple. After the peace deal, Twilight would merge into Dawn, but some parts were still hard to settle. Shin-Hyun told her they could pretend not to see it, but the whole world already knew, so there was no going back. She replied that there was nothing to worry about. Then she lowered her eyes and said she was disappointed. The protagonist stood beside Taehyun's body, as the girl said he had lived a hard life. Jae-Hyung let out a breath and admitted she never thought he would go out like this. The protagonist quietly said Taehyun's name, and the Heavenly Warrior's words kept echoing in his head. His face hardened as he thought about opening the door to ascension, about that state right before truly crossing over. Taehyun just stared in shock, while he kept thinking that if he didn't cast off his humanity, he'd lose everything. A rat hiding in the dark had even dared to threaten him. He took a hard sip from the cup and decided he wouldn't let it slide next time. The girl noticed and asked if something was wrong. He apologized and said he got lost in his own thoughts. Jae-Hyung told him he was giving off a scary vibe, then asked if he could check something. His eyes went to the iron box, and he asked what it was. She explained it was a secret safe from Twilight's leader's room, and neither opening nor breaking it had worked. Some kind of magic seemed to protect it. Shin-Hyun rubbed his face and said that was interesting. Then he smiled and said he normally didn't mess with things that belonged to the dead. Still, he sent his power into the safe, saying he almost felt bad since there might be valuables inside. His energy poured into the safe. The wheel on the front started turning. The door clicked open. Jae-Hyung jumped and asked how he did it, and he casually said the seal wasn't that strong. He picked up a folder and noted they had hidden it well. Opening it, he asked what kind of paper this was. Jae-Hyung quickly snatched the folder, saying she'd seen it before. Shin-Hyun looked surprised and pointed out that he hadn't finished reading yet. Looking over the pages, Jae-Hyung said it was a secret deal between the Junghyun Guild and Taehyun. If they worked with Twilight, every North Korean dungeon would be handed to Junghyun. The protagonist frowned in shock. What did it mean to hand over dungeons? He grabbed the phone, and as soon as he heard the voice asking how he was, he knew it was Kim Ka-yeol. The red-haired man reported from the dungeon entrance. Just like the protagonist ordered, every Simdado member who attacked them had been captured and would be arrested. While the protagonist sent out his power, he asked if they'd searched the area. Kim Ka-yeol said the dungeon inside was a mess and asked if explosives had been used. It was obvious something huge had happened there. Then he turned to the man still cursing and said he hoped to see him again soon. Shin-Hyun hung up, muttering that she was seriously annoying. He suddenly focused when he noticed the document mentioned the Tenjo Guild. Ji-Hae handed over the folder and said it wasn't very detailed, but it looked like 4 more people had returned from Murim. Flipping through it with a smile, he listened as she explained these were their personal files. They were known as masters who'd reached level 50, and he said now he understood why the guild was called Tenjo. He stared at her and asked if all of them were crazy fanatics. She said that seemed likely. The protagonist rose to his feet. Alright. Smiling, he said he had a new target now. Find every member of the Heavenly Warrior Guild and use poison on them. In Murim, getting swallowed up by someone stronger is normal, and this time, he planned to be the one who won. Dong Hwan stood beside the throne, where the blonde woman sat. He told the man with glasses that Dusk and Dawn were merging, but it wasn't Dawn taking over. Dusk was the one being absorbed. The other man confirmed it. She then asked if they'd heard from Gao Lin, but no one had gotten a response for 36 hours. Tilting her head, she suggested that meant both of them had failed. Taehoon had seemed completely sure of himself, and Yongcheng said that was what made this strange. Somehow, Gao Lin still lost. Dong Hwan added that every 10 Commandments member sent near the Cultivation Masters had also gone silent. Taehoon must have been right not to underestimate Shin Hyun. She replied that judging by his martial arts level, he'd trained for at least 75 years, putting him 68 levels above her. She gave a small laugh and said it was almost funny. The man glanced to the side. Yang Chung ordered them to learn more about Shin Hyun, but avoid direct contact and move slowly. Resting a hand on his knee, she added that both outer skill and inner power mattered. Strength alone didn't decide victory. At the Tamra Guild headquarters on Jeju Island, Yoon Sol called out to her brother. She warned him that if he ever ran off without her again, he'd die for real. Holding back a hit, she demanded to know if he understood. Shin Hyun apologized and said he hadn't meant to worry her. Then she asked where he'd gone, and Kim Kai-il stepped in, telling her to calm down. The protagonist shut his eyes, thinking this was a terrible welcome. Meanwhile, the Twilight merger had become the hottest topic around, and Jin Ho took charge. At the press conference, Jin Ho announced Twilight's dissolution. Jae-hae stood there with a folder, saying she wanted to dig deeper into the Jinjo Guild before they erased every trace. She kept studying the documents. The protagonist scratched his head and thought this might actually make revenge easier. Yoon Sel stood up. The man bowed and admitted the whole mess was his fault. He never expected traitors to be hiding among the Jeju guilds. The siblings watched in silence as he offered a sincere apology and asked how he could make it right. The protagonist closed his eyes and said he still didn't trust the Jeju guilds. There could easily be more traitors left. The man froze in surprise. Then the protagonist said he wanted to believe them, but what happened had destroyed that trust. The red-haired man stared at him, and he went on. If they weren't against him, then he wasn't their enemy. Clutching his chest, the man sighed in relief that they hadn't been cast aside and that fairness had won out. The others answered his call. The protagonist asked if they planned to come under Dawn's leadership. With a grin, he said the newly united Jeju guild should join Dawn too. They'd stayed neutral because of the fight between Dawn and Twilight, but now that battle was over. He pulled a folder from his portal and told them to come under Dawn's protection, since Jeju's strength alone wouldn't be enough to hold all the local dungeons. Shocked, the man took the file and said the whole alliance would have to decide, so he couldn't answer alone. His hands trembled, but he admitted it was probably the best offer they could get. He bowed to thank the protagonist, who said it was easier to trust each other when they were in the same boat. Looking ahead, he thought that if he spread his power to this island, finding every traitor would be much easier. As the man stood there holding the papers, the protagonist turned to the red-haired man and asked if he was leading the group. He said yes. Then he asked whether any agreed dungeon was still left. Kim Kail said one remained near Halasan, and the protagonist immediately told them to head there fast. Shin Hyun grinned and said he'd be very busy from now on. The sun shone brightly overhead. The protagonist asked if everyone was here, then pointed out the team only had warriors, tanks, and priests. A pretty odd setup. He asked why there were no mages or archers. The man met his eyes and explained that inside this dungeon, any long-range attack that relied on sight was useless. The protagonist looked confused. The brunette explained that the Halasan dungeon was one of the worst on the island, mostly because of the fog. It swallowed everything. The man went on, saying fog covered the whole dungeon, so it was hard to tell friend from enemy. Eyes appeared inside the mist, fog monsters. The group exchanged looks. One of them explained that the monsters blended into the fog. Normal physical attacks barely worked, and only wide area attacks could hurt them, but he cut himself off. With his hands in his pockets, Shin Hyun asked what else he was trying to say. Deep claw marks on a shield told the rest of the story, and the man added that the monsters were absurdly strong. Everyone watched as he said they attacked out of nowhere like assassins, and he'd nearly died more than once. He stopped, caught off guard when the response to his whole warning was that he talked too much. Scratching his head, the protagonist said he got the idea. They just had to hit them hard with the right skill. He stepped forward, said he understood enough, and told them they could stop explaining. Turning back with a smile, the protagonist said he'd just use a little more power. The two of them could only stare at him. One complained that he should have listened to the full explanation, while the other said that was just how he was. A portal opened, and the guy said the place felt strangely familiar. Standing still, he thought that even with a light breeze, he still couldn't see a thing. He turned at the sound of someone calling him. A man ran over and said he was glad they found him so fast. The rest soon gathered around, and someone suggested they stay close at first or they get separated. The girl formed a ball of light between her hands. She sent it ahead to light the path, and the man said moving with light was safer. He paused when someone suddenly asked if he was the leader of the group. Chai asked a basic question. Was the area near the dungeon entrance completely safe? Following the light, he got his answer. Yes, monsters had never shown up at the entrance before. Then the fog got even thicker. MC turned, confused. When he looked back again, everyone was gone. He called out, telling them to quit messing around. He couldn't see a thing in the fog, so why were they attacking out of nowhere? A monster slipped up behind him, ready to strike. It raised its paw and bared its fangs. Shin Hyun rushed in, power gathering in his hand. He moved in to hit it. His palm landed on the monster's face. Then he smacked it hard. His fingers dug into its face. With one brutal slam, Cha drove the monster's head into the ground. The other spun around, startled by the noise. Shin Hyun clenched his fist and realized what it meant. The monsters became solid right when they attacked. The white beast opened its mouth, and he turned at the sound. His teammates were already fighting the beasts. Someone asked why fog monsters were at the dungeon entrance, and Hajin ordered everyone into formation and told them to stay alert. Cha was shocked to notice signs of a jump. Shin Hyun looked down as someone shouted, asking where the healer was. A blue glow gathered near his palm, then shot through a monster's body as blue sparks scattered. More beasts were pierced by the beam. A bright blast followed. A shadow fell over Cha's eyes. Shin Hyun stood there calmly and asked if everyone was okay. The boy's eyes filled with tears when he heard that Shin Hyun had already checked the area with search magic. There were no more enemies for now, so they could rest. The man stared at him, thinking that in such a short time, Shin Hyun had already read the situation. Standing with the group, he asked if any monsters had escaped. He could still feel their energy, and if they needed help, they could ask. Hajin thought Shin Hyun had figured everything out and made a plan almost instantly. The brunette looked ahead with a faint smile. The man lowered his gaze, realizing that without him, their team might not have survived that first rush. Then his eyes widened when someone called his name. Shin Hyun walked over and asked if they could talk for a moment. Away from the others, Cha asked if monsters had ever attacked right at the dungeon entrance. Hajin said no, never. The hero touched his chin as Hajin explained they hadn't cleared this dungeon in a long time. That was likely why the monsters had built up so much they reached the entrance. Looking into the haze, the brunette said they'd need to learn more while clearing the dungeon. Fog filled the whole place. The beasts charged with their jaws wide open. Blue beams fired from Shin Hyun. The blue-haired girl frowned while watching him fight. She raised a hand and pointed out that he'd been holding the front line for 3 hours. Was he okay? Maybe he should take a break sometimes. Another bright beam tore into the beasts. Shin Hyun turned and asked if anything had changed from last time. The attack rate, the monster's strength, anything. The girl said there were definitely more monsters than in earlier raids. Other than that, it seemed normal. Hajin turned and wondered if it was still too early to judge because of their group size. Shin Hyun put his hands in his pockets and said he'd scanned 4 or 5 kilometers from the dungeon start and found something strange. The man blurted out in shock. His search magic reached that far? Cha looked away and said they'd find out soon enough. This was a dungeon, so a rise in danger wasn't that strange. An hour later, the man's eyes went wide. Standing in the white haze, he asked why the fog had become so dense. Shin Hyun gave a small laugh and said it looked more like a white wall. The brunette added that something else about it felt strange. The man reached into his pocket when Shin Hyun asked him to throw a dagger into the fog. Pointing ahead, Shin Hyun said there was a lump of energy right in front of him. Throw it there. Hajin said he got it and would try to hit the target. He threw the knife. The blade flew straight ahead and stabbed into a huge eye. The group was stunned. Shin Hyun said it was a perfect hit and told them to get ready. The man looked at him in fear and said something was coming. Cha stared forward without flinching. Something burst out out of the fog. It was a giant fog monster, with one injured eye. The boy trembled in fear, almost crying. He hid behind his shield and yelled, asking why it had to be him. The man swung his sword. With clean, fast strikes, Hajin cut the monster down. Afterward, he turned and told the boy to stop whining. The squad nodded when he said they could handle it as a team. Watching them, Shinhyun gave a quiet chuckle, and thought the group leader was pretty good. Then he looked away and decided there was no reason to step in. It was better to head deeper inside. A scream rang out, then another, and he wondered why they were coming one after another. White sneakers kept moving forward. Shinhyun walked into the fog, thinking he was waiting for one big target to show up. This was the second time, counting the monster in Buchan. As he looked ahead, he wondered if it came from some huge gate or something. A red glow appeared in the fog. It was a monster's red eyes. Without even turning, Shinhyun punched it in the nose. He figured there shouldn't be more than 2 monster types in this dungeon. The beast dropped, and he kept walking, thinking Jaehee's hair would stand on end if she found out about this. Then he noticed something and gave a small laugh. There was blue lightning inside the fog. A gate? The guy's eyes widened. No, something else. Standing before the blue crack, he said what it was. His fingers touched it like water, and he realized it was like the status window. There was nothing solid to grab. He pushed his fingertips into the crack, and thought that if he could only see it, then he couldn't affect it. A shadow crossed his eyes as he called for the status window. Windows appeared in front of him. Shinhyun reached out and said an unknown phenomenon was passing through matter. While the words began to spin, the guy clenched his fist. Hajin ran up from behind and said he was there. It looked like no large monsters were nearby. Then he was asked if he'd seen anything like a crack. Anxious, the man said no, and asked if something had happened. Shinhyun smiled. What did he mean? Was he the only one who could see it? Looking ahead with resolve, he turned to the heavenly warrior and asked if this might be that person's trick again. Jae was sitting at her desk. When someone knocked, she told him not to come in, but the man answered that he was coming in anyway. Donghwan appeared in the doorway with a smile. Jae let out a tired breath and said he must have heard her wrong. She told him not to come in. The secretary just smiled and handed over a stack of papers, saying he heard her perfectly. Still, she had probably been waiting for these documents more than anyone. Resting her head on one hand, Jae said she hated to admit it, but lately whenever she saw him, something inside her started boiling. Did he know why? She glanced at her phone as he replied that it was probably because he always brought more work. She said he knew exactly why. Excited, the man said this time it was about the incident site. Then he handed her a paper. The pink-haired girl's eyes widened. She asked if there had been deaths during the exploration of the new dungeon. As she pictured the scene, he explained that a team made up of mid-level hunters had entered, but they died before they could even use their skills. Standing by the desk, Donghwan said that no matter how you looked at it, this case needed her personally. The new dungeon seemed impossible to understand. The airport building came into view as a man walked with a suitcase. Shinhyun looked annoyed while guild members behind him begged him not to leave. He thought they had finally finished everything required by the contract. Cars moved along the road to Seoul. Inside one of them, Shinhyun stared at the green crystal. Yunsol called out, asking why he looked so lost. Was that the skill stone he got in the dungeon? The brunette grinned and said yes. It had dropped from a large fog monster, so he took it as his reward. He remembered Hajun giving him the stone, and Kai-Yul handing over a bag of tangerines. His sister said that if he sold the stone, it would be worth at least 1,000,000,000 won. As she drove, the girl said that made sense. But what about the large monster appearing at all? He replied that something like that had happened in the Bushan dungeon too. Shinhyun leaned on his hand while she said that meant at least 2 big monsters had shown up twice already. Were they seriously heading toward the end of the world? He frowned. The real issue wasn't the giant monsters. It was that crack. What was it? He remembered standing by the glowing crack and asking if anyone else could see anything. It let skills and martial arts pass through, and energy sensing couldn't detect it. The others looked ahead in confusion and asked if something was there. The brunette realized he was the only one who could see the crack. Hajun waved it off, saying maybe it was because Shinhyun's perception was abnormally high, but he couldn't say for sure. Could it be tied to the heavenly warrior?